Good morning, ladies and gentlemen. Welcome to the Public Service Commission of South Carolina. We're here in docket number 2021 88E. Let's take roll before we begin, roll. Present in the hearing room are Commissioners Caston, Williams, Thomas, Powers, Belzer, and Chairman Williams. Joining us virtually, we have Commissioner Urban. Yesterday we left off with Mr. Bell on the witness stand, and I believe Attorney Clancy finished her cross-examination. Want to go to now the South Carolina Department of Consumer Affairs to see if they have any questions for Mr. Bell.
Good morning, Mr. Chairman. Roger Hall for the department. I do have a few questions.
All right, please proceed.
Good morning, Mr. Bell. How are you?
Good morning. I'm well.
Good. I'm going to try to share, since we left off with it yesterday, the heat map, and I'm not going to dwell on it. But can you see that all right?
Yes, I can.
Mr. Chairman, can the commission see that okay as well?
Yes, sir. Thank you.
Okay. Like I said, I'm not going to dwell too much on this, but I think as we talked about yesterday, the colors on these maps don't really matter, right?
They don't really matter.
Right. And what's more important are the numbers in the charts.
That's right. They're based. They reflect system costs.
Yeah. And so what I'm showing is actually Exhibit KS1 from Mr. Searcy's rebuttal testimony. And at the top is Dominion's heat map. At the bottom is his, what he called the corrected heat map. And all the numbers on those two charts are the same, right? The dollar figures are the same.
That's Mr. Searcy's testimony. I didn't verify that. I assume they're correct. I do take exception to the characterization of a corrected heat map because there is not an incorrect heat map.
Right, and I guess for the point of this, I was just wanting to show that subject to check the numbers in his map are the same as the numbers in Dominion's map.
I would agree with that.
Are you aware, has any party submitted alternative pricing numbers as far as this heat map is concerned?
No party submitted alternative pricing periods for the standard offer. Witness Ori submitted a suggested recommended change for PR1 pricing periods, but nobody has suggested any different pricing periods for standard offer.
Thank you. And so again, subject to check, would you agree that the highest number on these maps is $42.18 per megawatt hour in January from 7 to 8 a.m.? Does that sound right?
I would agree with that for this particular map, but as I said before, this map is actually not the map you would use if you were to decide that you had to pick pricing periods based on colors. You wouldn't even use this map. This map was it was included in one of the 5 output data streams. You would actually, if you decided you had to use this heat map to create pricing periods, you would actually take the numerical average of all 5 seeds like we did when we developed the pricing, and you would apply a heat map to that.
Okay. And again, I guess, I'm sorry to interrupt you, but for my purposes, the heat map doesn't matter. I'm really just kind of looking at the dollar figures in it. If it helps, I'll try to zoom in again, not being able to see exactly what the commission can see. Can you still see those pricing periods in January from 7 a.m. to 9 a.m.?
Yes, I sure can. Okay.
And so again, subject check, we decided that the highest number is $42.18 from around 8 a.m. And would you also agree that the next 2 highest numbers are also in January from 6 to 7 a.m. and 8 to 9 a.m.?
I'm sorry, I kind of lost track there. What was that again, sir?
So the next 2 highest numbers pricing are from around 7 a.m. in January and around 9 a.m. in January?
I believe so.
Okay. And those numbers would support that Dominion's capacity needs are being driven by its winter peak. Is that right?
You could say that they are suggestive of that, but nothing would prove a capacity need other than a reserve margin calculation, a reserve margin policy. You would
Sure.
not use marginal cost to make that determination.
But it does reflect that some of the highest costs on here are in the winter mornings, in that January in particular.
It does reflect that.
And so you mentioned the reserve margins. Are you familiar with the 2020 modified IRP?
Yes, sir.
Okay. And do you recall that in that submittal, Dominion stated that the plans were built to meet a minimum 21% winter reserve and a minimum 14% summer reserve?
That is correct.
Okay. And that was specified by the commission in docket 2019-2026E. Is that right?
I believe so.
Yeah. And in fact, in order 2020-832, the commission determined that 21% peaking reserve margin was the appropriate target to use when setting avoided cost rates. Does that sound familiar?
Can you repeat that?
The commission determined that the 21% peaking reserve margin was the appropriate target to use when setting avoided cost rates.
They determined that that was the correct reserve margin to use for the integrated resource plan, which is one of those plans. The approved plan is the basis for our IRP calculation.
That's right. And that also implies the company must maintain additional generation capacity during its winter peak compared to its summer peak, right? And I think I just spoke before that, is the basis of our the IRP plan is the basis of our avoided cost calculation. And sorry, I was thinking about that when you asked this last question. No, that's actually the point I was trying to make, that the IRP that's been approved by the commission is the basis for your avoided costs. One of the resource plans is the plan that's in the Plexus model, that has the resources that are in the Plexus model. That model is used for the avoided cost calculation. Yes. That's all the questions I have.
Office of Regulatory Staff.
Good morning, Mr. Chairman. This is Chris Schieber for ORS. We do not have any questions for Mr. Bell. Thank you.
All right, sir. Commissioner questions for Mr. Bell. Vice Chair Belzer.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Good morning, Mr. Bell.
Good morning, Commissioner.
I think that the finger has been pointed at you as the person that came up with the pricing periods. Am I correct?
Yes, ma'am.
And with the solar standard offer, the non-solar standard offer, Dominion has proposed 11 periods. Is that correct?
That's correct.
And how many time periods has Dominion proposed for the solar?
There's no time periods for the solar. That calculation is based on a solar profile, which on average, any single axis tracker that's either on the system or would be installed on this system would have almost the exact average output as that profile.
Are you familiar with the two orders that the commission issued? The first order and then the order on reconsideration from the 2019 avoided cost dockets?
Somewhat, yes.
Are you aware that, and I'm reading from page 9 of the order on recon, the commission stated, additionally, Act 62 requires transparency from the utilities in the avoided cost proceedings. The commission expects and requires a much more detailed and transparent analysis concerning the seasonal and hourly value allocation for solar generation in the next avoided cost case. Are you familiar with that language?
I don't know as I knew that exactly.
Has that been done here?
We provided, the reasons for developing the solar profile. It's based on actual, solar facilities on this system. We used the profile of what is the most likely configuration of a solar plant that would be installed on the system. And the avoided cost that's calculated from that is very accurate.
And where is that information?
I believe it's in, if it's not in, witness Neely's testimony, it's in our data request responses.
Okay, and if it's in the data request responses, how does the commission get to see that?
I do not know the answer to that, ma'am.
Okay. And from our original order that was issued in December 2019, order number 2019-847, the commission, in referring to the qualified independent third party, commission stated pricing periods should be chosen to reflect discernible pricing patterns and underlying differences in avoided costs throughout the day. Use of broad pricing periods increases the risk that these periods are composed of times when there are consistent underlying differences in avoided costs, which would be better reflected in more narrow pricing periods. So tell me how one price for solar for throughout the day comports with what the commission was saying about more narrow pricing periods, please.
So could I ask you?
You want to put that up?
Um,
You want to see it?
yes, ma'am. Yes,
Okay,
ma'am.
hold on. I've got somebody coming. I only have one copy. It was in discussion. Well, let me ask you this while that's getting up there. Are you aware that Dominion, or that the solar pricing periods were changed with the reconsideration from the last case, that we increased the number of pricing periods? The commission did. Are you aware of that?
Yes, ma'am, I am aware of that.
And so Dominion has chosen to not follow that structure, but to go back to only one pricing period.
We are, yes, ma'am, we are proposing one pricing period, and there's a good reason for that. I'm not, until I don't want to comment on it until I see the language.
That's fine. I just wanted to know if you were aware that there were more solar pricing periods from the last avoided cost proceeding than what's being proposed here. Okay, I think there they go.
Vice Chair Belzer, this is Tracy Green. I'm not sure the witness can read that. If his screen is like mine, it's very small
Okay.
on the display.
Let's see, can we enlarge that anyway? Does that help any?
Yes, ma'am.
Let me know when you've had a chance to.
Yes, ma'am. I just see in the line above that it says proposed for non-solar QFs. I'm not really seeing where this is, maybe I'm missing it, where it's applying to solar.
Well, maybe I picked up the wrong language.
Ma'am, and the reason I was really looking at that critically
Johnny.
was because, non-dispatchable solar, they can't actually move their energy into different pricing periods. So there would be, there would not be a more accurate pricing period for them than a single price.
Wait,
Oh.
wait. Don't do that yet. Okay, I appreciate that. It went away. Can y'all put that back up there though? I have all of y'all beat for the technology award. Just be aware of that. Okay. The one in pink. Can you see that again, Mr. Bell?
Yes, ma'am, I can see it now.
Okay, so where it says pricing periods should be chosen to reflect discernible pricing patterns and underlying differences in avoided costs throughout the day. Can you just tell me if that's been done in this proceeding?
It has been done for PR standard offer non-solar.
Okay.
And I guess just what I'm saying here is I'm looking at this and it starts off at the top where the 4 time of use are not applicable to solar QFs. And I'm sorry, I don't know what the text says outside of this, so I'm not disagreeing with you.
I understand, but and you're you say that's been done for the non-solar, and
Yes, ma'am, and I would like to iterate that. So the marginal costs that we used, that we provided, that are the basis for our time periods for non-solar, those would not be the right marginal cost to use. If you were to develop a pricing periods scheme for solar, you would still have to use the solar profile as your avoided cost basis to produce those marginal costs. And so you would take the marginal cost that we produced already and just apply it to those different profiles.
okay, I appreciate that.
It could be done. It could be done, but it would just be a slightly different basis for that calculation.
Okay. I think that responds. Thank you, Mr. Bell. I appreciate your testimony.
You're welcome.
All right. Any other?
Chairman.
Okay. Commissioner Thomas, then Commissioner Caston.
Thank you. Good morning, Mr. Bell. Good to see you
Morning.
again. Are you aware of Mr. Burgess's rebuttal testimony, the Carolinas Clean Business Associates witness? And he discusses the possibility of integration charges being double recovered. Are any charges collected in the fuel proceeding that are included in the VIC? Or are these amounts removed from the fuel case?
Yes, sir. They are not double counted and they are removed from the fuel case because what is actually happening on a monthly basis is that the credits that are paid to the solar provider for their energy are at the rate less the VIC. And so it's netted in the actual transaction before it goes into the fuel clause. So it doesn't need to be recovered or unrecovered in the fuel case.
Okay, thank you. Appreciate that. So let's talk about the possibility of a VIC study, and just like to hear your thoughts. If you know what all is involved in a study, how long it takes, how much it costs.
Yes, sir. We've participated or supported 2 VIC studies, one for the 2019 hearing or docket and one for this docket. So it would take it would take several months just to do that part of the study. But I believe the integration study that we're all referring to that has an open docket right now isn't narrowly focused on the VIC. That could be one product from that study, but it's I would would not recommend. My interpretation of that statute is that the study is to develop a strategy to integrate renewables statewide.
Okay. Thank you. I appreciate that. That's all I had.
Commissioner Caston.
Good morning, Mr. Bell.
Good morning, Commissioner Caston.
Can you give me a brief definition of production cost modeling?
Yes, sir. So one of the I can point back to my direct testimony where we probably have introduced the Plexus model before this, but we have a more robust explanation in the last few testimonies I've submitted. And production cost modeling is like one step in production in modeling stages that culminates in the portfolio optimization. So the production cost model is a solver that can either maximize profit or minimize costs. It has a mathematical engine that's kind of the kernel of the software, and that solver is a cost minimizer or profit maximizer. Since we're a regulated utility, we try to minimize our costs, and so what we do is the software is actually designed where you can model the units on the system, you can model their efficiencies, their constraints like minimum up and down time, their fuel costs and varying fuel costs. You can put in streams of fuel costs, 30, 40, 50 years long. It can be, we run one production cost model daily that we only look at 7 to 16 days with that one. It optimizes and then on the other side of it, so there's a supply side, you also put in the demand side, which is the system loads and any sales that you are committed to selling off system. And what it does is it matches that supply to that load in the most cost-effective manner, in the lowest cost manner. And it does that for every hour of every day for the entirety of the run. And that can be 30 years worth in our case with the IRP. In this case, we study 1 year and 10 years for the avoided cost. I think that answers the question, but let me know if I left anything out.
Well, I actually read what you had in your testimony, and you I was hoping for something like 25 words or less, but I didn't specify.
I'm an engineer.
But I think I understand what you were saying. Let me see if I can sum it up. And if it's not even close, tell me. But if it's close enough, I want to try to keep it as few words as possible. Basically, forecasting, looking to the future amount of electricity produced by generation source. And I guess optimizing that generation source based on that future demand. Is that close?
Oh, that sounds like a good general description of that. And one thing I left out about the production cost model is it's precise. It's so precise in its optimization that what you can do is you can look at differences in costs. That's one of the values in that is if you put in a higher load or higher DSM or cheaper fuel or a different type of unit, it can evaluate that so closely to the optimized point that you can see the value differences, and that's exactly what we do in avoided cost actually.
Looking at over those particular runs and those future demands, attempting to optimize the best generation unit for that particular situation, or what, correct?
That's right.
Okay.
That's right.
All right, so I've kind of gotten a little confused here in the back and forth on looking back, you know, in the past, looking to the future, you know, relative to the modeling, you know, the best way to determine the VIC. So is it fair for me to say, or am I correct in saying this? And I don't want to misinterpret what I think I've heard Dominion say and read from you. Are you saying that the past cost, demands, everything, the past is not relevant and you have to look to the future? Or are you saying that it's both?
You know, I hope I did not say it wasn't relevant. But I also have an idea that the reason it's relevant is because we have an interim variable integration charge. We don't usually have interim avoided cost rates, and the VIC is an element of the avoided costs. So I would just say that normally when we do avoided costs, we're looking at the next, say, 100 megawatts of QF generation that could be on our system. And we study the cost, the value, the avoided cost actually is a better term, for that next increment of generation. So usually you have a model and you're forward looking, and that's no different than any other avoided cost. And we just have the different situation where we have an interim VIC with a true up, which I don't, you know, I don't have a long history with the avoided cost, but I don't believe that's ever been an issue before, that there would be a true up after the fact. So this is kind of a new twist that, and you know, some witness Burgess, I believe, is saying that we should analyze the actual costs in the past. And I'm saying just off the cuff that if we did analyze the costs in the past, we would still do it with a production cost model.
Okay, so, well, before I try to attempt to give you an analogy to see if it's kind of close, what I think I've read, or what I think I'm understanding, especially from the God House study, or what's being said, is the past numbers, cost, do not reflect or are accurate for the current cost or the future cost, because either the increased amount of solar, the increased cost because of that, the reserves that are needed. Here's my analogy, and tell me if it's kind of close. Knowing that water distribution and water's not electrical, but similar principles, I hope, if I'm going to have a chance of understanding this. In looking to the future, planning for the future, how big our transmission lines, water transmission lines needed to be, how much supply do we need, how much energy we'll need, production, size of pump stations, when and where. We had to look to the past to use numbers to project for the future. In other words, these were the demands in the past, and this was the slope of the line. It was a particular slope which gave us a per capita day. And looking to the future, we'd look at the population projections and take that per capita day and kind of project it, and it'd give you a slope of a line. Now, through the course of time, the per capita day numbers began to change because of the ubiquitous nature of water saver devices. You know, the new developments were all putting those in, toilets, fixtures, and the old houses like we had, your fixtures wore out and you eventually had to replace them, so you could only replace them with those. But my point being is we look to the past, but those numbers were becoming, at least the per capita numbers were becoming not what to use because the slope of the line had changed. So when we look to the future on our projections, we had to use modified per capita numbers to come up with those numbers. Now, am I kind of understanding, probably more so in the reverse, is that what this production modeling does? Is this what Guidehouse has done? Is this what Dominion is saying? Something along those lines. You're not ignoring the past. Or are you ignoring the past? I think you said no. But you're building from that, knowing that you're saying that the numbers are inadequate now, but for the future they will have to be this because the slope of that curve has changed or the slope of that line has changed. Does that make any sense at all?
It does, and I'll just confide that, you know, being an electrical engineer, sometimes I do have to use water analogies to explain some parts of electrical engineering. But to your basic question, so one of the key elements of the production cost model is the demand, the load forecast, right? And that's what you were kind of talking about with how much do customers use. And the load forecast is actually something that I don't do. That's just an input that's handed to me from the forecasting department. And they use very complicated econometric models that use the past and trends and then expected changes in the future to develop that load forecast for the future. So I think that answers one part of your question. Another part is that it's a little bit different than water because, I'm definitely no expert on water, but you know, the electricity comes from many, many different types of sources, and I think that's a little bit different than water, and that's what makes the cost curve so dynamic in electric production. Did I touch the key elements of your question?
I think so, and you guys can't build a reservoir to store a lot of electricity. I understand that.
That was something that came to mind early on. Is we don't have much of a water tank. We've got one pump storage facility, but compared to the size of storage that you would have for a water system, it's very inadequate. So.
Well, what I was trying to get a better understanding of, using obviously not the greatest analogy, but trying to understand the banter back and forth between looking at the past, you know, projecting or looking to the future. And I think I understand it's not one or the other. You look at this, but you got to project it based on what at least your model. Now that's debatable whether that's accurate or not. Some say it is. Dominion says it is, and intervener says it isn't. But in essence, that's what you're doing. Looking back at those numbers, they're not, according to Guidehouse, not the numbers that need to be now. They need to be this. What it seems to be telling me is that there does need to be a variable integration study to kind of help resolve this issue. Would you agree?
Yes, sir. That we've submitted Dominion Energy South Carolina submitted a variable integration cost study in the previous avoided cost docket, and we have again in this one, and we believe those accurately inform the variable integration costs within our service territory. And when witness Peter David is on for questioning and to give you his testimony, he can better elaborate on what elements of the model included the past and which ones include the future. If that's that, and I can see how that is a point of confusion and that needs to be clarified. But he has our system modeled, and he knows what contracts we have for solar and when those contracts are coming online and which ones came online when. So I believe it's an accurate model for that VIC. But we are not opposed to continue to study the VIC. And I would just leave it at that.
Understand. Thank you. A couple more questions and I'm through, I promise. Keep hearing, I guess the 1 hour ahead, what will provide better, more accurate information. What has to occur? What does Dominion have to do for this to occur, the ability to have that information, that 1 hour ahead or whatever that optimal information is?
That point is, I think it's the easy answer as what has to happen to get a 1 hour forecast is we have to decide who's going to pay for 1 hour forecast and procure 1 hour forecast. They are available. And we didn't, I don't dispute that we could have a 1 hour forecast. If there's any part that I have a contention with is the fact that it would be more accurate in a planning time frame. I agree that it would be more accurate in a 1 hour time frame, but the variable integration charge is due to carrying reserves. And most of the time, because of the economics of fuel right now, those additional reserves are units that would be offline and would take a long time to start up, and you can't start them up at 1 hour ahead of time.
Okay.
So there would be some value, but there would be a lot more value if the forecasts were more accurate. Say 8 hours, 12 hours, 24 hours ahead of time. And they also, as witness Hanslick mentioned, that even though, right now we forecast load in 1 hour increments, but witness Hanslick showed that even if you had a 1 hour forecast of, say, solar next hour is supposed to be 752 megawatts, it could be much higher, much lower during the hour, which he still has to follow that load. Even though a 1 hour forecast might say that it averages out or integrates out to be, some number, 500 megawatts, it could actually be much higher or lower than that during the hour. So there's other issues to consider along with 1 hour ahead forecasting.
Okay, so it sounds like you're saying 1 hour ahead forecasting would be great, but I think I'm hearing you say that some of the generation requires more than 1 hour to initiate.
That's right.
So having more accurate forecast period, a day ahead, if you could, have real accurate for that day or the next 8 hours, you're saying that is of greater value or equal value or lesser value?
That would be to have more accuracy day ahead, which is totally, that's weather forecasting, that's weather technology. That would have the greatest value. But any improvement would have some value, but we completely rely on the weather forecasts as an input to our solar forecasts.
I understand. Finally, I think Mr. Burgess stated, I don't remember where in his testimony, but that it took several weeks after desk testimony to provide data on operating reserves. Is this true? And if so, why did it take so long?
I don't know the exact timing on that, but, so the operating reserve data that we provided, has never been asked for, and has never been part of a voided cost proceeding before, so, we actually had to see if we had that data. And we had never, data mined it before either. So, but I'm not sure about the exact timing of why it took, as long, or didn't take as long as he might be implying. I'm not sure about that.
Well, if I heard Mr. Neely correct, he said Dominion attempted to and did provide the information that they had, that they could develop in a timely way. Some information, as I understood him, that I think pretty much says what you said. We probably have it, but we don't know how to get it, so it's going to take time to pull it together. Is that what I'm hearing?
That is one of the elements. The other element is some parts of the avoided cost data, the inputs to the model outputs and stuff. We were able to provide those as soon as we had the rates, that we could provide the rates, because that's all one process. But the operating reserves data was not part of that process, and so we could only start working on it once we got the request, because we had no idea it would be requested.
But in your honest opinion, do you believe that Dominion, during this process, voided cost, currently, and I guess tomorrow and in the future, are being transparent and providing everything that you can in a timely way?
We have heard that, we've heard that loud and clear, and we believe we're being responsive, and transparent. The amount of data we provided this time, even if you just talk about that, operating reserve data request, I mean, that data, there was so much data there that, it literally wouldn't fit, in one sheet of a spreadsheet. It was tens of thousands of rows of data. So we provided all the data we were asked for, and that we thought was relevant, and we believe we're being completely transparent and responsive.
Well, that's good to hear. I certainly hope that is the case. I have no basis to doubt you, but I think that's a good thing and a good step in the right direction.
Thank you.
All right. Thank you, Mr. Bell.
Mr. Chairman.
Commissioner Irvin.
Sir. Mr. Bell.
Good morning, Commissioner Irvin.
Have you ever been involved with a study? It's the commission previously ordered in its last what it calls docket.
Mr. Chairman, this is John Burns. I don't know if I'm the only one, but I'm having trouble hearing the commissioner.
Commissioner Irvin, if you could increase your volume, sir.
It's better.
That's a little better. It sounds a little distorted.
Yeah. Okay. Let me see if I can shorten up my sentences. Is this better?
No, sir. Let me check with the live stream producers to see if there are any issues on our end.
I'll pass for now, and maybe I can submit my question to one of the other commissioners. Sorry for the audio problems.
Okay. Yes. Commissioner Williams.
Thank you, Chairman Williams. Mr. Bell, appreciate your continued testimony and patience with us.
You're welcome.
I want to take you back to the conversation that you started with Commissioner Thomas about the statewide integration study. This is just a good opportunity for us to understand the relationship between the VIC and the integration study that will be forthcoming. Would a statewide integration study have helped inform the VIC study?
Yeah, and Commissioner Williams, I don't want to act like I'm the expert on a statewide integration study. I think that there's probably many people that would be involved in determining the scope of that study and what the deliverables would be in that study. But I believe that could be one element of what's produced, I guess the deliverables of the study. Yes, ma'am.
So did you just tell me it would be informative on a future VIC study?
I think it could be if that's if the group decided that would be an element of focus on the study, which I agree with you. I think it would be. I'm just saying I'm not necessarily going to determine that. So.
No, I understand. And would the data from your smart meters be beneficial to that study?
That just depends. So smart meters, the AMI, those meters are on the load side, and I had not really envisioned that the renewable integration study would be about maybe I thought it'd be mainly focused on the supply side, but it could take into it and any production model that you ran in that integration study would take into account any kind of DR or energy efficiency gains because of the smart meters. It would be included, but I'm not sure it would be a center point of that.
And is Dominion also going to integrate kind of smart devices on the transmission and distribution side?
I just know the term smart grid. I'm not really well informed as to what those devices are.
Okay. Thank you. That's I know it's a little far afield, but it was a good opportunity to learn a little bit. Locational marginal pricing has come up in some of the testimony. Did Dominion focus on that at all?
Yeah, we know the term because that's a term that they use in standardized markets like PJM, MISO, and it describes it usually describes. I might be going too far afield in this myself, but it describes the pricing at different locations on the system. And usually those prices are different because of transmission constraints and differentials in prices due to generation that cannot reach from one point to another. And, that you could do that you probably could do that on our system but normally those prices would be the same as the system marginal costs on the desk system.
And another term that was new to me is the performance adjustment factor. Did DESC consider using one? I think you did not, but set me straight.
The discussion, and I'm probably secondhand information on this. Witness Neely is definitely the expert on this topic, but the PAF, was used by Duke apparently in their avoided cost. We do not feel it's appropriate. It actually inflates the cost of generation. It values it at above its actual cost, so we don't believe it's appropriate for avoided cost.
And I appreciate your taking helping out another colleague that we've already passed by, but can you explain why? Can you take it a little further?
So, okay, I think I better not, because I
Okay.
would like to say that I
Okay.
would not.
I understand that. Thank you very much for your answers. No further questions.
Commissioner Urban, I'm going to circle back around to you, sir.
Yes, sir. We were having some technical difficulties earlier. Can you hear me now?
Loud and clear.
Great. Mr. Bell, how long would it take to complete a study like the one we've been discussing, approximately?
Sir, are we talking about the variable integration charge study or a statewide renewable integration study?
The first one that you mentioned.
Variable integration charge study?
Correct.
It could, seems like it could take a month to 3 months to do.
Who would be qualified to conduct that study?
People that are familiar with electric utility systems, and there's quite a few consultants that are fit that category too.
Is it a costly study to conduct?
It is a time-consuming study that uses relatively pricey models, so that there is a significant amount of cost involved.
Would the Office of Regulatory Staff be the appropriate entity to lead that study under Act 62?
They would for I think that the Act 62 language around the statewide integration study says that they would be involved with that, and they could be. They also do hire consultants routinely to analyze our data, our results, and also conduct their own studies. So they certainly could do that.
And I believe Mr. Willoughby pointed out to me earlier that in fact is what the statute guides us in terms of going forward with it. So when we get to the ORS witnesses, we'll ask them more about that. But I'm a bit concerned about having this interim VIC over an extended period of time without a true up. Do you have any concerns about that?
Sir, that's really not my area to be concerned with that or not. I work very hard to produce accurate avoided costs.
I understand. Let me just ask it another way. Is it your understanding now that all parties have essentially agreed that 96 cents per kilowatt hour is an appropriate amount for the interim VIC in this proceeding?
Sir, I don't, I don't know the position of all the parties in this. I was involved in, providing information and support for Guidehouse to do the VIC study. I believe their study is accurate.
Okay, I'll ask another witness about that. But you think that study could be completed in 1 month, perhaps?
I think it would be difficult to complete it in a month, but it is possible. We're just talking about the Dominion Energy South Carolina system here. Since we've recently provided that data, it also depends, like there was a benchmarking process that we talked about in the development of that, in Guidehouse's development of that study. And so sometimes like Guidehouse was actually involved in the modeling for the Southeast Energy Exchange market. So, and that was only done less than a year, maybe right at a year ago. That's a complete guess. Sorry about that. But recently, relatively recently, so they already had a lot of the modeling in place for our region, including our service territory. So if somebody didn't have that, it might take longer.
So you're saying that Guidehouse might be the entity that would have a bit of a head start on the process since they've been working in the Southeast.
Oh, that is definitely true. Yes, sir.
That might save us some time and money if we went that route, since they've recently been through the data. correct?
I can't speak toward the money, but I would definitely say the time that is true.
Thank you, Mr. Bell. No further questions.
Oh, you're welcome.
All right, any redirect? Okay, Mr. Bell, thank you for your,
I'm sorry. Yeah, no redirect. I apologize, Mr. Chairman. I could not get my button clicked fast enough. No redirect. Thank you very much.
all right. Mr. Bell, you are excused.
Thank you, sir.
All right. Would you please call your next witness?
Good morning, Mr. Chairman, members of the commission. Can you hear me well this morning?
Yes, sir.
Thank you very much. It's a pleasure to be with you again today. I'm calling our next witness, Mr. Peter David, to the stand. Mr. David, I see you're on the screen here. The court reporter will swear you in, and then I will begin to ask questions on you.
Mr. David, if you'll raise your right hand, please. Do you solemnly affirm that the testimony you're about to give will be the truth, the whole truth, and nothing but the truth?
I do.
Thank you.
Good morning, Mr. David. Would you please state your full name for the record?
My name is Peter B. David.
And by whom are you employed, Mr. David, and in what capacity?
I am an associate director with Guidehouse in our energy sustainability and infrastructure practice, and I head up our wholesale markets analysis and modeling team.
In connection with this proceeding, did you prepare and cause to be pre-filed a direct testimony consisting of 39 pages?
I did.
And does that testimony have attached to it 2 exhibits, the first exhibit having 3 pages and the second exhibit having 41 pages?
That is correct, yes.
Now, referring back to the testimony itself, I'll come to the exhibit in just a moment. But in regard to the testimony, are there any corrections or changes to be made to the testimony?
Yes, there are.
And Mr. David, would you direct us to the page and line numbers where those corrections need to be made?
Yes, sir. So the first, there are 3 total. They are actually all the same thing to be corrected in 3 different places. But the first is on page 17 of my direct testimony in line 19, where at the end of line 19, the phrase weighted by hourly solar production should be changed to weighted by whether or not solar is generating.
If you would do this, I want to make sure the court reporter gets it very accurately, Mr. David. Would you state that change again? I got page 17 and line 19. And
correct.
State what is being stricken and what is being inserted in lieu of the stricken language.
Yes. Strike weighted by hourly production and insert in its place weighted by whether or not solar is generating.
Thank you very much. That's a correction 1. Lead us to correction 2 now.
Correction number 2 is on page 23. Starting in line 4, please strike based on hourly generation and replace that with weighted by whether or not solar is generating. Additionally, on line 6, please strike beginning with the word and through the rest of the paragraph. So strike and impacts during hours in which solar generation is high are weighted more heavily than impacts during hours in which solar generation is low.
Is that the third correction, Mr. David?
No, I'm sorry, that is all part of one correction.
So that was correction number 2.
Yes.
And then now, correct us to correction 3.
Correction number 3 is on page 25. It is in lines, at the end of line 4 and beginning of line 5. Where it says, excuse me, it begins on line 3, where it says, Guidehouse weighted the change in operating costs due to increased operating reserve levels by the hourly forecasted solar generation. Please strike that and change that to Guidehouse weighted the change in operating costs due to increased operating reserve levels by whether or not solar is generating.
Are there any other corrections or changes that need to be made, Mr. David?
To the direct testimony, no.
Thank you very much. If I asked you the questions that appear in the pre-filed direct testimony as corrected by the 3 corrections you've just given us, would your answers today from the stand be the same?
Yes, sir, they would.
Mr. Chairman, I would move in the corrected pre-filed direct testimony of Mr. David as if given orally from the stand.
Mr. David's directed pre-filed direct testimony will be entered into the record as if given orally from the stand.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. And next, Mr. David, I've mentioned that there were 2 exhibits attached to your testimony. One is your exhibit 1 is 3 pages, and I think that is your biographical information. Is that correct?
That is correct.
And then exhibit 2 is your variable integration cost study. Is that correct?
Yes, that is correct.
Are there any changes or corrections to be made to either of the exhibits?
Yes, I have a small number of corrections to exhibit number 2, correcting in a couple of places the exact same references I just corrected in my direct testimony.
Would you direct the court reporter and the parties in the commission to the page number? I don't think we have line numbers in the study, but to the page number where the correction needs to be made, and you'll have to direct us to the page, to the spot on the page where the correction is required.
So let's go to page 7 of 41. In the 3rd paragraph, which is next to bullet number 6, the paragraph starts, the difference between total production cost during solar generation hours only is taken and weighted by solar generation. Please strike during solar generation hours only is taken and after the words weighted by, please insert whether or not there is any. So it should read the difference between total production cost weighted by whether or not there is any solar generation. Similarly,
that's correction number 1, correct?
Yes, that is correction number 1.
Now direct us to correction 2.
Staying on the same page, going into the footnote that is referred to in that bullet, where it states the VIC is solar generation weighted, please strike that and replace that with the VIC is weighted by whether or not solar is generating. And then please strike the next sentence that states, for example, the difference in total production costs during a midday hour where there is peak solar generation is weighted proportionally more than a shoulder hour where there is less solar generation.
So that last sentence that you just referred to should be stricken.
Correct.
Your direct us to the next correction.
The next correction is on page 13 of 41. It is the exact same as the prior. The prior page that we were looking at was the executive summary, and now we are into the meat of the analysis, and this is actually just repeated. So again, in page 13 of 41, next to bullet point number 6, in the sentence, the difference between total production cost during solar generation hours only is taken and weighted by solar generation. Please strike during solar generation hours only is taken and please insert whether or not there is any between weighted by and solar generation. So it should read the difference between total production cost weighted by whether or not there is any solar generation.
And the next correction.
The next correction is in this footnote on this page. That is, again, the exact same as the previous one. In the footnote, where it states the VIC is solar generation weighted, please strike that and change that to the VIC is weighted by whether or not solar is generating. And again, in the next sentence, please strike, for example, the difference in total solar production costs during a midday hour where there is peak solar generation is weighted proportionally more than a shoulder hour where the sun may be rising or setting and there is less generation.
Are there any other corrections, Mr. David?
Yes, sir. There are two more corrections where we're going to strike some language.
Refer us to which page?
The next correction is on page 25 of 41. It is in under where it says 2.4 calculating integration costs. It is in the second paragraph. Starting in the fourth line of that paragraph, please strike while the hours when solar generation becomes its largest impacts integration costs the greatest.
And the final correction.
Final correction is on page 32 of 41. In the paragraph that continues from the prior page at the top of page 32, in the final sentence, please strike and more heavily weighting hours where solar generation is high as compared to hours where solar generation is low.
Does that conclude all of the corrections, Mr. Davey?
Yes, sir, it does.
And with those corrections, the exhibits, both 1 and 2, are ready to be introduced into the record. And Mr. Chairman, we would move into the record as the next hearing exhibit. Mr. David's exhibits 1 and 2 to his pre-filed direct testimony as corrected. And we would, of course, move the introduction of those 2 exhibits as Exhibit 2 has just now been corrected.
All right, David's Exhibit 1 and 2 as corrected will be marked and entered into the record as a composite exhibit, and we are at hearing Exhibit 3.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Mr. David, have you prepared a summary of your direct testimony?
Yes, sir, I have.
Please deliver that summary at this time.
Good morning, Chairman Williams and members of the Commission. My name is Peter B. David, and I am an Associate Director in the Energy Sustainability Infrastructure Practice for Guidehouse, formerly known as Navigant Consulting Incorporated. In June 2021, Guidehouse completed a study titled Variable Integration Cost on behalf of Dominion Energy South Carolina Incorporated. In my direct testimony, I discussed the background, key concepts, and definitions that are useful to understanding the study, summarize the study results, explain methodologies employed by Guidehouse, and conclude with a more detailed analysis of study findings and conclusions. The study evaluated a baseline scenario as well as the variable integration costs for 3 different scenarios of solar generation installed on the system. These scenario assumptions were developed to align with DESC's existing penetration, system needs, and internal studies. The baseline scenario includes all of the interconnected solar generation with PPAs that do not include any variable integration charge clauses, totaling 340 megawatts. The Tranche 1 scenario includes all of the baseline solar generation, plus all of the interconnected solar generation with PPAs that do include a variable integration charge clause, totaling 633 megawatts. The Tranche 2 and Tranche 3 scenarios include the solar generation with PPAs, plus assumed tranches of future penetration that is not currently under contract or actively in development. Those tranches are 100 megawatts and 300 megawatts incremental, respectively. As I explained, the study finds that solar generation is an intermittent resource whose production depends on factors inherently outside of DESC's control, such as prevailing weather conditions. As a result, it is possible for there to be a significant variance between the amount of generation that is expected from solar versus the actual solar output. The potential for solar forecast error introduces a measure of uncertainty of the generation needed from the rest of the system that increases as solar penetration increases. In order to account for this uncertainty and ensure that load and current operating reserve obligations are met, increased solar penetration will require increasing the minimum operating reserve requirement beyond its current level. Increasing the minimum operating reserve requirement will change system dispatch. Flexible generators, such as combined cycles, will have to frequently operate at levels below their maximum capability, which is less efficient and thus more expensive per megawatt hour in order to provide operating reserves. The energy those flexible assets would otherwise provide will instead come from less efficient and more expensive generators, such as coal or gas-fired steam turbines, or increased net imports. The end result will be an overall increase in system operating costs. DESC currently has 340 megawatts of solar capacity under contract without a variable integration charge clause included in their PPAs. There are roughly 633 megawatts of solar capacity, bringing total installed capacity up to 973 megawatts, that does have a variable integration charge clause in their PPAs. The levelized cost of maintaining additional operating reserves for that tranche is approximately $1.80 per megawatt hour. As solar penetration increases, the levelized cost of maintaining additional operating reserves will increase as well, due to having to operate the system in an increasingly less efficient manner. The levelized cost of maintaining additional operating reserves for the next 100 megawatt tranche of solar above 973 megawatts is $3.43 per megawatt hour. And the levelized cost of maintaining additional operating reserves for a third tranche of an additional 300 megawatts of solar capacity is $4.64 per megawatt hour. Building additional resources, such as quick-start combustion turbines, battery storage, or combined cycles to provide additional operating reserves would reduce the VIC and reduce operating costs, but these savings would not offset increased fixed costs. The capital investment required for these facilities at current technology costs is far greater than the increase in system costs calculated in the study. However, it is possible for solar projects to mitigate their own potential forecast error by installing co-located battery storage. Facilities with existing contracts could change operation to be more flexible. Solar assets that take these measures and can show mitigation results will not require increasing operating reserve requirements and thus should not be subject to a variable integration charge. This concludes the summary of my testimony.
Thank you, Mr. David. I believe you also prepared in cost to be pre-filed in this docket a rebuttal testimony. Is that correct?
That is correct.
And I believe that rebuttal testimony consisted of 34 pages and there were no exhibits attached to your rebuttal testimony. Is that also correct?
That is correct.
Are there any corrections or changes to be made to the rebuttal testimony?
Yes, there is one correction.
Please direct our attention to the page and line.
Starting on page 9 in line 21 and going through the first line of page 10, where it reads, however, as Mr. Burgess has seen in the Guidehouse VIC calculation workbook Excel files for each solar tranche that were provided in response to ORS request for records 1-4. Please strike that entire sentence and replace it with, however, as Mr. Burgess has seen in the Excel files provided in response to CECIBA request for records 2-14.
Thank you very much, Mr. David. With the correction that you've just given us, if I ask you the questions that appear in the rebuttal testimony as corrected, would your answers today from the stand be the same?
Yes, they would.
Mr. Chairman, we would move the corrected rebuttal testimony, Mr. David, into the record as if given orally from the stand.
Mr. David's rebuttal testimony as corrected will be entered into the record as if given orally from the stand.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Mr. David, have you prepared a summary of your rebuttal testimony?
Yes, sir, I have.
Please deliver that at this time.
In my rebuttal testimony, I respond to certain issues raised in the direct testimonies by Mr. Edward Burgess on behalf of the Carolinas Clean Energy Business Association and Mr. Brian Horry on behalf of the South Carolina Office of Regulatory Staff. Witness Burgess wrongly characterizes the Guidehouse study as a rough approximation and criticizes its inputs as grossly misrepresentative of DESC's actual operating practices. Guidehouse has a well-earned reputation for providing an independent, thorough, and detailed forecast of North American energy markets. Calling Guidehouse's approach a rough approximation entirely mischaracterizes the entire field of production cost modeling and ignores the care, due diligence, research, and professional analysis supporting the study. Guidehouse also worked closely with DESC to verify its system operating parameters. Witness Burgess repeatedly criticizes the use of modeled results instead of DESC's actual integration costs over the last 2 years, particularly as related to the level of operating reserves DESC has maintained over the last 2 years, as more than 80% of the solar facilities comprising Tranche 1 have come online. First, Guidehouse's modeled variable integration cost is based on what operating reserve requirements should be, not what they have been in the past. Second, the fact that DESC has not had an insufficient reserves event in the last 2 years is not evidence that Guidehouse's recommended operating reserve requirement is unreasonable. Third, his attempt to tie future integration costs to historic integration costs ignores reasonably expected future generation developments impacting DESC's system. The VIC proposed by Guidehouse is a net present value that is levelized across 10 forecast years and is driven by changes in the generation landscape. Guidehouse did not, as Witness Burgess claims, significantly overestimate the integration costs included in the VIC. In fact, Witness Burgess' admission that he does not know whether or not the company's current operating reserve practices are appropriate proves he is guessing without any substantive analysis. Witness Burgess also claims there are multiple deficiencies that invalidate the results of the study. However, as I explained in my rebuttal testimony, these claims are unfounded. Witness Burgess claims that there is no need to increase the minimum operating reserve requirement because the average operating reserves available on the company's system in recent history have exceeded the increased operating reserve requirement as modeled by Guidehouse. Witness Burgess ignores that it is absolutely normal to experience available operating reserves significantly exceeding minimum operating reserve requirement, and that the available operating reserves in any given hour can vary significantly from the average. Witness Burgess also claims that the change in production costs due to an increased minimum operating reserve requirement should be weighted by the level of solar production in each hour, rather than the binary weighting employed based on whether or not there is any solar generation in that hour. I note that I considered the merits of weighting by solar production, but I ultimately concluded, based on my analysis, that an unweighted average better reflects the cost to the system. Witness Burgess also claims that some of the costs to integrate the Tranche 1 solar capacity should be allocated to the 340 megawatts of baseline solar facilities. However, The incremental increase in reserves calculated for this scenario were based on increasing solar penetration by 633 megawatts and do not consider the existing 340 megawatts of baseline solar penetration. Witness Burgess also claims that Guidehouse's modeled incremental increase in operating reserves is inflated because the reserve shortfalls are less than the recommended incremental increase in operating reserves. However, he fails to recognize that an increase in incremental operating reserve requirement is fundamentally different than an increase in available operating reserves. The operating reserve requirement modeled in PROMOD is the minimum amount of operating reserves that the company must hold. Witness Burgess's claim that a VIC of $0 per megawatt hour is appropriate is simply expressing, without evidence, what his client wishes the VIC to be. However, there is an integration cost incurred by the company as a result of adding solar, and Witness Burgess provides no meaningful analysis to show otherwise. At bottom, Witness Burgess recommends that integration costs be shifted to retail customers. As an alternative to the zero VIC, Witness Burgess recommends the VIC for Tranche 1 facilities be set at $0.28 per megawatt hour. However, this recommendation is based on correcting claim deficiencies that, as explained in my rebuttal testimony, are not actually deficiencies. Witness Burgess and Witness Ori both believe that Guidehouse should have used a 1 hour ahead rather than a 4 hour ahead solar forecast to calculate the potential solar forecast error and thus the incremental operating reserves increase, thus the incremental increase in operating reserves necessary to integrate each tranche of solar capacity. Although solar forecast uncertainty would be reduced using 1 hour ahead data, 4 hour ahead data better matches the data that DESC receives from solar facility operators. This concludes the summary of my rebuttal testimony.
Thank you very much, Mr. David. Mr. Chairman, Mr. David is available for questions from the parties in the commission.
Johnson Development Associates.
Chairman, good morning. Court Walsh with Johnson Development. No questions. Thank you.
Carolina's Clean Energy Business Association.
No questions at this time, Mr. Chairman. This is John Burns.
Pine Gate Renewables, LLC.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Bland Hallman with Pine Gate Renewables, and I do have some questions, and I'm also sporting some pretty nifty headphones, so I can be sure and hear Mr. David. Mr. David, good morning. I'm Bland Hallman. I'm with Pine Gate Renewables. How are you?
I'm good, thank you, Mr. Holman. How are you today?
I'm fine. Can you hear me okay?
I can hear you. Can you hear me?
Yeah, I just want to make sure I'm not too faint. I've got a good number of questions, but I've tried to keep them focused so we can move quickly because I know the proceeding has gone for quite a while. Let's just start with the tranches of your study. You divide the different solar penetration levels according to the tranches. Is that correct?
Yes, that is correct.
And that was to study their incremental impacts on the integration costs, right?
Yes, sir, that's correct.
But the dividing line between the baseline generation of 340 megawatts and tranche 1 is based on the term of a contract. Is that right? Some have the VIC charge, some don't. Is that right?
Yes. The first 340 megawatts of installed solar do not have any sort of VIC clause included in their PPAs, while the first tranche that we studied, which is 633 megawatts, that takes the total penetration up to 973, is the tranche that currently has the interim VIC as part of their PPAs.
Okay. And when you ran tranche 1, did you include the cost of baseline solar in that?
How do you mean, did I include the cost of baseline solar in that?
Well, did you do an incremental analysis for tranche 1 that excludes the 340 megawatts baseline, or was that already assumed to be in the system?
That solar generation is already assumed to be in the system, so it is part of the baseline analysis. The tranche 1 analysis included two model runs, both of which had 973 megawatts of total installed capacity. So the entirety of the baseline solar plus the tranche one solar. And the difference between those two cases, and this is how we calculated the VIC, was a case run using the current 250 megawatt minimum operating reserve requirement, and then a second case run using the increased operating reserve requirement as dictated by my model.
Right, but you weren't able to back out the 340 megawatts from those. You didn't do a modeling run.
No.
You somehow backed out the 340 megawatts. Okay. I just
No,
want to get
that would be
there. All right,
inappropriate
let's
because that doesn't match how the system operates.
Okay, we'll get to that. We'll get to that. Forecast error. I'm just move from topic to topic rather than just go through your testimony. Forecast error. When it comes to forecasting, you agree with what Witness Burgess that the percentage drop matters less than the drop in absolute megawatts. Is that right?
Yes, certainly. I will agree with that.
And you'd agree that the absolute magnitude of forecast error goes down as solar production goes down, right? There's less chance of a large megawatt drop at the end of the day when production is low and the sun's almost down. There's just less megawatt to lose. Is that right?
That is correct to a certain extent. However, it is not necessarily what I would call a linear relationship. And by that, I mean that during hours in the morning and evening when solar generation, when expected solar generation is lower, the percent level of potential forecast error is increased. So what I mean by that is that the magnitude of potential solar forecast error does decline as the expectation for solar generation declines. However, it does not decline at the same rate. So if you have half as much expected solar generation in a given hour because it's a morning or evening hour as you do in a peak hour, that does not mean that the potential for forecast error is also cut in half. That potential forecast error might only be reduced by something like 25%. So it is slightly lower in magnitude, but not as reduced as the solar forecast or the solar generation reduction.
Understood. Thank you. You'd also agree that forecast error is reduced the closer your forecast is to the forecasted event. So a one hour ahead forecast will generally be more accurate than a 4 hour ahead forecast.
I do agree that a 1 hour ahead forecast of solar generation would be more accurate and would lead to a reduced potential for solar forecast error. However, as I have explained in my testimony and as company witnesses Hanslick and Bell have both explained as well, that would not have been appropriate to use for this study, both because it does not match the level of data that Dominion receives, and also a 1 hour forecast. If Dominion relied on 1 hour forecast, they would not necessarily have enough time in the planning horizon to actually maintain the level of operating reserves that such solar forecast error calculations would dictate.
Thank you. We're gonna get to some of those points. I'm just trying to look at forecast error, just some specific discrete issues here. Did you read ORS witness Ori's citation to a 2015 study suggesting that solar forecast errors could be reduced by about a half if a 1 hour ahead schedule was used?
I did not. I did see I did, however, see the study that Mr. Burgess pointed to in his testimony from the National Renewable Energy Laboratory, NREL, that indicated that that solar forecast error could be reduced by something like 40% using a 1 hour ahead forecast as opposed to a 4 hour ahead forecast.
Okay, and you yourself testified that using a 1 hour ahead forecast of solar generation rather than a 4 hour ahead forecast in comparison against actual generation would produce significantly less forecast error, correct? That's your direct testimony, page 26.
Yes, I mean, as indicated in the study that Mr. Burgess pointed to, that reduction would be about 40%.
Okay, and you say that ideally your study would have used the difference between a 1 hour ahead advanced schedules and actual operations to estimate the marginal need for operating reserves created by solar resources, correct?
in an ideal world, we would use that. In an ideal world, that would be the kind of information that Dominion Energy both had and had the time to respond to. However, that's an ideal world. That is not the world that we live in.
Okay, yeah, you said that data is unavailable, correct? From Dominion.
That data is, I'm sorry, can you repeat that?
Sure. I think you just said in an ideal world, you would have that and the system could respond to it. And I took that to mean, and I thought your testimony said that that information was not provided to you by Dominion and it is unavailable. 1 hour.
That is correct.
Ahead.
It was not provided by Dominion. It was my understanding that it was not available to Dominion in terms of the data that is currently available to them. And it was not available to me either.
Okay. And you're not testifying that 1 hour ahead forecast data is not commercially available, are you?
I am not testifying to that, no.
Okay. And the modeling you did to develop the VIC did not use 1 hour forecast in calculating solar forecast error in Dominion territory. It used the NREL 4 hour ahead forecasting data. Is that correct?
Yes, sir, that is correct.
And that NREL forecast, it tell me if I've got this wrong, is kind of a modeled forecast where you can enter coordinates of a location in Dominion's territory or any territory, and it gives you a kind of a 4 hour ahead forecast for that location. Maybe you give it some data about what the size of the facility is or that kind of thing, but is that how that forecast works?
Yes, functionally that is how that forecast works. It has both 4 hour ahead forecast and 5-minute actual real-time generation for a wide variety of sites across the country and specifically within Dominion service territory.
Okay, and then you compared those forecasts to the production data from actual facilities on the DES system?
We compared those forecasts to a comparable set of 5-minute generation data also from NREL. That way we were comparing data that was matched to the exact same latitude and longitude coordinates and from the exact same source to prevent any errors from using out-of-sync data.
Okay, so you did not use Dominion actual generating data from solar facilities on Dominion system. Is that right?
Not from the data that was on Dominion system that was provided by Dominion. This is data from sites around Dominion service territory that correspond with Dominion with the actual sites in Dominion. But all of the data that we used for this was from NREL, because as I mentioned, it would have been inappropriate to use mismatching data sets.
Okay, let's turn to another topic. You calculated that 60% drop based on the difference between the NREL forecasts and the, I guess now I'm understanding it's the NREL forecast versus the NREL actual production data, which is not from actual facilities, but is what NREL is based on the irradiance that actually occurred at the forecast time. Is that right?
Yes. That's correct.
So if Dominion Solar is producing 1,000 megawatts, let's say, does the 60% mean that it needs 600 megawatts in operating reserves? Is that what your operating reserve?
I would disagree with that characterization because we did not attempt to peg the operating reserve requirement to be a percentage of solar generation or solar capacity, excuse me. The 60% value that you are referring to was a conservative estimate for what the maximum potential missing generation from solar might be, what the maximum potential solar shortfall might be, unexpected solar shortfall, might be based on the operating reserve requirement that we modeled, which was based on the NREL data.
Okay, so
60% is not really 60. Yeah, back of the envelope. Sorry, you go ahead.
No, I was just trying to make sure I understand. So,
Excuse me, gentlemen,
so when you're doing your pre-mod.
gentlemen,
Yes, sir.
I'm sorry to interrupt you. It looks like we're going to be here for a while with this testimony, which is fine. But let's take a 10-minute break. We'll be back at 10:45.
Very good. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Good morning, ladies and gentlemen. Welcome back to the Public Service Commission of South Carolina. We're here in docket number 2021-88E. Let's take roll. Present in the hearing room, we have Commissioners Caston, Thomas, Williams, Powers, Vice Chair Belzer, and Chairman Williams. Joining us virtually, we have Commissioner Urban. Attorney Hallman.
Yes, thank you, Mr. Chairman. Mr. David, we were, I think, talking about starting into some of the calculations you did and in determining the VIC. And I just want to ask you a little bit about the data and formulas you provided. You know, we were talking about the NREL data. Did you provide which proxy sites from the NREL data that were selected for each facility?
Yes, I did. I provided the latitude and longitude coordinates for each of the solar sites in the NREL data, and then matched those with the latitude and longitude coordinates for the actual physical sites for existing assets on Dominion system.
Okay, and did you provide the formula guidehouse used to compute forecast error for each increment at each facility?
As I explained in my responses to those requests for records, there was no formula workbook to calculate the solar forecast error. That was modeled using a Monte Carlo simulation.
Okay. Did you show how the forecast errors were aggregated to a system-wide total?
I believe so, yes.
And did you provide formulas showing how the forecast errors were then fed into the Monte Carlo simulation?
The Monte Carlo simulation was used to determine the forecast error. It was used to compare the 4-hour ahead scheduled data to the 5-minute actual data in order to determine what the forecast error is.
Okay. So you've provided all formulas you've used in your study. Is that correct?
Yes, I have. That is correct, sir.
Not just output data, not just input data, but all of the formulas used to make the calculations?
Yes.
Okay. All right, let's get back to the VIC and what comes out of this process. Now, we were talking about whether or not you use percentages of solar generation per hour. In other words, your VIC, and we heard about some corrections to your testimony earlier today, the VIC is not weighted on an hourly basis. Is that correct?
That is correct.
Okay. And so
the only weighting, I'm sorry. The only weighting is a binary weighting based on whether or not there is any solar generation in the hour. So that excludes overnight hours where there is no solar generation, but all solar generating hours are treated the same.
Okay. And then you use that to summarize, I think, table 11 in your testimony, your direct testimony. You've got a table there that shows the total reserves required by solar tranche, and it goes by month. It's like month 1, 2, 3, 4, and to civilians like me, that's January, February. Okay, and then you've got, for example, for month January, you've got baseline solar, and then you've got tranche 1, which is 341 to 973 megawatts. You've got showing there in January 494.1 megawatts in operating reserves. Is that right?
That is the total minimum operating reserve requirement for January with the tranche 1 solar facilities all online.
Okay, and
for
that is August,
inclusive of all operating reserves. Yes, sorry.
So do you mean that if, for example, Dominion already had 250 megawatts of reserves online, that you could deduct that from what was calculated to be included in the VIC? Is that what you're saying right now?
What I am saying is that that is the total operating reserve requirement that includes the 250 megawatts that is the current minimum operating reserve requirement. So the incremental increase in the minimum operating reserve requirement for January for Tranche 1 is 244.1 megawatts.
Okay, and in August, it would be, I'm showing 556 in your table 11. So in August, in Tranche 1, that would be 556 minus 250 would be the incremental that's charged to
Correct.
solar facilities in Tranche 1? Okay.
Correct.
All right.
In August, it is 306.9 is the incremental. And if you, I know you're referring to my to the table 2 in my direct testimony right now, but if you look at table 1 in my in the study attached as an exhibit to my direct testimony, it breaks down the incremental operating reserves as opposed to the total cumulative operating reserves that you were looking at. So they are both presented here.
Alrighty. Now it looks like the lowest reserves are needed in December and January, and the highest reserves are in April.
That is the result of our modeling, yes.
Okay. And I just want to be clear, because I think actually there's some confusion on this. In your modeling for, say, August, you're showing 557 megawatts there. And this is table 11. You mentioned table 2. I'm looking at table 11, total reserves required by solar tranche. So total reserves required, and that's 557. And you're saying that those 557 megawatts of being those reserves would not be the only cost that would be attributed to solar would be the 557 minus whatever reserves are already on the system?
That is close to correct. What I'm saying is that the only costs attributable to Tranche 1 solar are the costs associated with increasing the minimum operating reserve requirement by 307 megawatts to make the total minimum operating reserve requirement 557.
Okay. Okay, gotcha. All right, now, so, and for that 557, sticking with that in August, the same, because you're not doing hourly weighting, for every, as you said, it's binary, so solar's operating or not. If it is operating, for every 1 hour that it is operating, you need to have the 557 in August for Tranche 1. Is that right? 7 a.m., noon?
That is the minimum requirement that is applied to every hour. However, that is only the reason that I did not weight by hourly production is that is only a binding constraint during a small number of hours of the month when solar production is peaking. During other hours of the month when solar production is low, during morning and evening hours, that is not a binding constraint because the available operating reserves, even when the minimum operating reserve requirement is set to the baseline level of 250 megawatts during those hours, the available operating reserves significantly exceed that minimum requirement.
Okay, so is that why you did hourly weighting and then decided not to do hourly weighting?
When I first began this engagement, I was under the impression that hourly weighting would be necessary. That was an assumption that I made going into this because that was, I believe, a criticism levied at the Navigant/Guidehouse study that was presented in the proceeding before this commission 2 years ago. However, as I got into the analysis and actually started analyzing all of the results, that is when I determined and discovered that that the minimum operating reserve requirement, as I mentioned, is only a binding constraint in those handful of hours each month where there is peak solar, and in all of the other hours where solar generation is reduced, it is not a binding constraint because during in the scenario in which the minimum operating reserve requirement is set to the 250 megawatt baseline, the available operating reserves in those hours significantly exceed what I have calculated as the increased operating reserve requirement for that month. Therefore, any changes to operating costs in those hours driven by the increased minimum operating reserve requirement are not actually driven by the need to hold additional operating reserves in those specific hours, but rather by macro level system generation changes required to optimize the generation in order to ensure that you have that level of operating reserves available during those peak solar hours. That is why we ultimately concluded that it would be inappropriate to weight by hourly solar generation, because that would be applying a inappropriate reduction to any sort of production cost changes in those low solar hours.
Okay, so if I understood you correctly, had you used, and maybe you did run the numbers, I don't know, on hourly, but had you done so, you think, first off, the VIC would have been lower, but you think that would have been not proper?
That is correct. Weighting by hourly solar production would have produced a lower result, but it would not have been an appropriate thing to do, because the changes, as I mentioned, the changes in costs in those low solar hours are directly related not to the change in operating reserves required in those hours, but rather to the change in operating reserve requirement during peak solar hours and overall system optimization.
Gotcha. Okay. Now on the 60% drop, I think you testified that it doesn't represent a scenario in which every single facility's production simultaneously drops 60%. Instead, it's a scenario in which the production from a select group of facilities drops to or close to zero, while the rest are entirely unaffected. Is that right?
That is correct.
Okay, and when you said select in your testimony, you said a select group of facilities drops close to zero. Can you tell us what you mean by select there?
I simply mean by I simply mean a subset. So not every unit, not every solar facility that's online in Dominion service territory, but some subset of those units that are relatively geographically close and thus would be likely to be impacted by these same weather systems.
Okay, did you select them, or did anyone select them?
No. So I am making no judgment as to which specific solar facilities would be impacted. That is why the 60% value that you speak of, it is not used anywhere to calculate the VIC or to calculate the operating reserve requirement. It was simply an estimate based on what we did calculate as the operating reserve requirement for what the maximum potential solar shortfall might be. And again, this would very much depend on which specific solar facilities were impacted, which is why in the workbooks that I provided that showed what the maximum potential solar shortfall was, we simply took the total solar generation in that hour and reduced it by 60%, because we are not making any sort of judgment as to which specific solar facilities would be impacted. We are simply saying that in a worst case scenario of this total solar generation that is expected in this hour, we may be missing up to 60% of them from some thus far unknown set of solar facilities dropping to zero.
Gotcha. Okay, well that leads to our next topic, thank you, and which would be geographic diversity. Got a series of questions on that. You say at page 21 of your direct, you included actual data from 40 solar sites in the company's footprint, and that if you had not considered geographic diversity, the potential for forecast error would have been greater, right?
Yes.
Okay, so the less geographic diversity, the more forecast error. Is that correct?
Yes, absolutely. If we had not accounted for geographic diversity, if we had just looked at a single solar facility, well, if its solar production was supposed to be maximum and it dropped to zero, then we would show that the maximum total potential solar shortfall would be 100%. That would be, I don't believe that would be a reasonable assumption. I don't believe there's any sort of reasonable scenario where the system would be expecting for all solar facilities to be generating at maximum output and receive no solar output from any of them. And that is the kind of scenario that we would have encountered had we not included a measure of geographic diversity in our solar forecast error calculations.
Okay, and does that go for variability as well? I mean, sometimes people use variability and forecast error interchangeably, but I think you don't. So is geographic diversity, no. I assume it's the same for variability as well?
Yes, and that has to do,
okay.
You know, that has to do with the fact that the different solar locations will have different levels of expected output, right? So their output, both in terms of what is expected and what is actually achieved, will be unique to their specific location. So what we did was account for solar forecast error to determine across the entire system what is the maximum potential unexpected drop in solar generation aggregated across all generators, but taking into account each of their individual profiles.
Understood. Now, does geographic diversity have more or less impact when there's a predictable statewide phenomena like a large rain front or sunrise or sunset? Does geographic diversity kind of matter less when you have something that's affecting the entire region?
To be honest, I'm not entirely certain. I would say that if you have something that is going to affect the entire region, like sunrise or sunset, or a very large storm front, that is not likely something that would impact forecast error significantly, because that is something that should be accounted for in the forecast. If there is a massive storm front that is coming in that will cover the entire state of South Carolina, that is something that would be accounted for in the forecast of how much solar is going to be expected. Whereas I would certainly not expect for there to ever be a circumstance where Dominion is expecting for there to be a sunny day and all of their solar facilities to be generating at the middle of the day at or near their maximum capabilities, and for a massive storm front to then roll in and cover the entire state. That seems like that nobody predicted coming. That seems like a very unlikely outcome.
Agreed. Okay. Although we do have thunderstorms here in South Carolina. Let's see. Moving on. Did you provide the formulas and methods you used to determine geographic diversity, or did you provide, or on the alternative, did you provide the data and spreadsheet output? And I'm thinking of your rebuttal testimony at 12, and you said you provided the Excel spreadsheet and, quote, data that demonstrates the impact of geographic diversity on solar. So did you provide just the data, or did you provide the actual formulas that you used and methods?
We provided all of the data, including all of the latitude and longitude data to demonstrate the fact that geographic diversity was considered in so much as was appropriate. And again, as you keep pointing to, there was no formula workbook to account for geographic diversity, because that was specifically accounted for within the Monte Carlo simulations that was determining the solar forecast error by looking at each of the individual sites and their latitude and longitude coordinates.
Okay. So, and you said in your testimony that those formulas don't exist because, quote, Guidehouse employed a VBA-based model to conduct Monte Carlo draws to compare the actual generation data to the scheduled data, right? That's what you just basically said, I think. Okay. Yes. So do the Monte Carlo draws themselves show the relation between geographic diversity and how that diversity impacts smoothing of solar output?
The Monte Carlo draws themselves look at each of the individual solar sites individually, calculate from the specific draws, calculate the solar forecast error on a site-by-site basis, and then aggregate those to a total. It does not, in the output, it does not give an individual site-specific solar forecast error. It simply aggregates them across all of the sites where they're specific based on their location and their forecast and actual generation based on their actual at each individual site solar forecast error.
So there's not a separate calculation of what the spatial relation between the facilities does to the forecast error or coincidence or anything like that?
Not separately, no, but because all of the draws are done for the exact same day and time for each of the individual solar facilities, there is that correlation is implicitly included.
It's built in, kind of baked in.
Right. Yes.
Okay, and if you had a more solar facilities that were even in different locations, you think the same relationship would just invariably hold true?
If we had more solar facilities in within the exact same geographic footprint, so still within Dominion service territory, then yes, I do believe that relationship would still hold true. If we were talking about expanding the size of the utility footprint, then that might change my answer, because that would increase the overall geographic diversity. But the existing solar facilities, as well as the NREL data, represents, I believe, a pretty significant amount of geographic diversity that is as much as is available to Dominion within their service territory.
Okay, but is that based on their existing facilities?
Yes, the NREL sites the NREL sites that were chosen for this analysis were chosen based on their latitude and longitude coordinates and how closely they matched with existing baseline and tranche 1 solar facilities.
Okay. All right, moving on to a favorite topic in this hearing has been Fairfield pump storage development. You say that Fairfield pump storage is able to provide operating reserves when called upon. Is that right?
That is correct.
And you note that with the increased adoption rate of non-dispatchable solar on the system, Fairfield pump storage is an important asset for grid stability, reliability, and power quality for the system.
That is correct.
And you say that Fairfield can generate and provide operating reserves during the vast majority of solar generating hours, including the sample hours with potential operating reserve shortages.
That is correct.
And you call Fairfield's operating costs as operating expenses de minimis.
Yes.
Okay. Can you tell me how many megawatts the Fairfield pump storage development generates? I've seen in the PERC license issued last year that it was like 512 megawatts, but I've seen in other materials that it's 576 megawatts. Do you know which one it is?
Off the top of my head, I do not. I am not certain. I believe it is. I believe I do have it listed in my. Yes, I have it listed in my big study as 576.
Is that in table 3?
And that's how modeled it as 576. It's in table 5 on page 15 of the study.
All right. Do you have it also in table 3? You've got a. This is the summary of Dominion resources showing capacity and quick start capability.
Yes.
Okay. And you show it as not having quick start capability?
In our modeling, no, it does not have quick start capability.
Okay. But all right, help me figure this out, because I think you also said that ProMod can immediately turn on Fairfield to provide operating reserves up to 99.9. Okay. So you did include it?
So when we say quick start reserves in the way that ProMod operates, that is meaning that it is going to count it as potentially contributing towards operating reserves even when it is offline. We did not model the pump storage facility that way because, as I discussed in my rebuttal testimony in response to a criticism levied by witness Burgess, we did not model it that way within ProMod because its actual ability to provide quick start reserves is dependent on several factors such as reservoir levels that you really cannot have information about that far ahead of time without conducting the modeling exercise. However, by indicating that it can provide spinning reserves instead of quick start reserves, and the significant lack of constraints on the dispatch of the pump storage facility as compared to dispatching a thermal facility, and by lack of constraints, I mean lack of VOM charges, lack of fuel expenses, and lack of minimum up and down times, when it is needed to be called on for operating reserves, it can be ProMod can immediately turn it on and count up to 99.9% of its availability as counting towards spinning reserves in any given hour, as long as it is available to generate, as long as the reservoir is filled.
Gotcha. Okay, thank you. Let's talk a little bit about economic dispatch. I think the results of your modeling, it shows that things like, tell me if I got this right, that basically because of the variability of solar, you're needing to have a load, more of a, what I would consider a load, take a combined cycle plant as an example, something that would otherwise be providing energy is now, you need to throttle it down so that it can provide reserves. And in its place for providing energy, you might spin up a coal plant. Is that the general gist of what's happening to the I would call it kind of a dispatch inversion?
Yes, at a high level, that is the result of increasing the operating reserve requirement. You are going to take flexible generators, which are largely combined cycles, and under other circumstances, without the increased operating reserve requirement, those combined cycles might be providing baseload generation, but instead you are ramping their production down, which increases their dollar per megawatt hour cost to produce the power they are producing, because that is actually a less efficient state for them to be operated in. And in their place, you are making up for that missing generation by utilizing other more expensive assets, such as coal plants or steam gas plants or combustion turbines, as the case may be, that might otherwise not be in use if those combined cycles were generating at full capability.
Okay, thank you. Now, if the operating, and if this kind of is driven by the scale of the operating reserves, the operating reserves required were lower, then you would have different options for how to dispatch. Is that right? But because of the magnitude kind of drives the resource you need to have in that flexible mode. Is that right?
That
so a combined cycle plant.
But again,
go ahead.
I just want to point out that that minimum operating reserve is only a binding constraint in a handful of hours. However, because you need to make sure that you are meeting that operating reserve obligation during those small handful of hours that have that binding constraint, that requires then, for example, as I believe Witness Bell and Witness Hanslick have both discussed, if you need to start up a coal plant because you need it to you need it to provide energy during a midday peak hour when you absolutely need a combined cycle to be providing some additional flexible reserves, well, that coal plant takes maybe a day, maybe longer to start up, and it has a very long minimum operating time. And so, in order to start that up, and it also has a relatively high minimum generation ability. So you start that up, and in a low solar hour in the beginning of the morning, you've got this coal plant generating with a reduced operating reserve requirement in the middle of the day. That coal plant might not have been called on at all. However, because it's going to be needed in the middle of the day, it had to be called on earlier, which means that it is generating early in the day, which means that in that hour early in the day, there are other natural gas combined cycles that might have their operations higher, closer to their maximum capabilities, but are being ramped down, not because they need operating reserves in that hour, but because they will be needed later in the day, and they need to ramp down because there's only so much load that needs to be served.
Okay. And do you know in your modeling, like what the capacity factors are for these coal plants in this scenario you're discussing? You're doing production cost modeling. How much are the coal plants getting used, and is it kind of significantly increasing their capacity factors on an annual basis, or is it just doesn't really change?
It does not significantly increase their capacity factors on an annual basis. I don't have directly in front of me what their annual capacity factors ended up being in the analysis. But what I can tell you is that in in the baseline and benchmarking exercise, one of the reasons that we did some iterating around that was to ensure that all of the different technologies were generating at similar levels to recent history. So the output from the coal plants that are on Dominion's system in our model is very close in our forecast to what it had been in the last several years.
Got it. Okay. And so those coal plants are now, they're increasing their production to provide energy. Is that right?
On occasion, yes, they are increasing their production to provide energy. They are
I mean, for your VIC.
They are not being directly relied upon for, yes, they're not being directly relied upon for the operating reserves because they're not flexible enough.
Right. Okay. So, this gets to just in terms of the cost, and now you're calculating for the VIC, you're calculating, okay, now we got to run this coal plant. It's less efficient in providing energy, and we're going to attribute the increased cost of energy to the solar facilities because they are the ones, in your view, that have incurred the kind of costs, right?
Yes. Well, the increased coal output is directly related to the increased operating reserve requirement for the small number of hours where it's a binding constraint. Therefore, it is directly related to, it is a direct result of the cost to integrate that solar capacity.
Right. Now, since it's providing the energy, and so the increased energy costs are being included in the VIC, I'm just curious why you couldn't, to provide that energy, look at something like SEAM, that Southeast Energy market, as perhaps defraying those energy costs. You didn't look at that because it's too speculative. Is that right?
It is very speculative. That was the primary reason behind not including it in our model. As has been, as Witness Bell just mentioned in his testimony this morning, Guidehouse has actually been very intimately involved in modeling the potential impacts of SEAM for a number of stakeholders in the Southeast. We are very keenly aware of what the implications for SEAM would be and where it is in its current process. And it is our position that it is far too speculative to include as a baseline assumption here. There is a possibility that that the inclusion of SEAM could help reduce energy costs in some hours. However, that would also be dependent on Dominion's neighbors having excess energy to share in those hours, which is not something that I can comment on right now.
Okay. All right. Thinking about the generation mix on Dominion's grid, you say that adding new resources like combustion turbines, battery storage, solely to provide operating reserves is not a cost-effective approach to lowering the variable integration costs. What do you mean by solely there?
What I mean is that you could increase the system's ability to provide quick start reserves by installing more combustion turbines or by installing utility scale battery storage systems. However, if the purpose of installing those is to reduce the need for other operating reserves, that does not actually reduce overall costs, because the capital investment required to add those resources to the grid significantly exceeds what I have calculated as the costs associated with increasing operating reserves of the current grid in order to integrate this level of solar.
So if there were other reasons to add those facilities, then that maybe becomes a closer call?
Potentially. However, again, given the costs associated, the capital costs associated with each of these technologies, if you would invest roughly the same amount in building each of these technologies as would be required, as I have calculated the increase in costs associated with these variable operating charge, you would only be able to build a very small amount of each kind of any one kind of technology. As I said in my study, you could add approximately 33 megawatts of quick start CT, or 21 megawatts of a 2-hour battery, or 13 megawatts of a 4-hour battery for roughly the same cost as the total 10-year cost of increasing operating reserves to integrate the first tranche of solar.
Okay.
So not only is that not nearly enough to cover the increase in operating reserves, but that would be a very small amount of energy also being added to the system that would not have a significant impact on the cost to produce energy either.
Right. And but there could be other reasons to add those resources. I think you say in your direct testimony, page 28, that it could have other benefits, such as decreasing overall production costs, but those are not evaluated in your study.
That is correct.
Okay. And when you're doing your production cost modeling,
sorry, I was going to say there could be other benefits, but you would have to you would have to score those with the capital investment cost that those technologies would require.
Okay. And I think this probably goes without saying, but I just want to make sure I'm clear on it. When you're doing your production cost modeling, you're using Dominion's what was then its latest IRP. That's got these coal units retiring, I believe, in 2028.
Yes, those coal units retire in 2028, and there are the existing coal units mostly retire in 2028. There is one, I believe it's Cope, that converts that currently burns both coal and natural gas, and in 2030 will convert to burning only natural gas and no coal. So by 2030 there will not be any coal on Dominion system. That is that is what is indicated in their modified IRP, and that is how we modeled the system.
Gotcha. Okay. We're getting towards the end here. You'll be happy to hear. Let's see. You say, I think on your rebuttal testimony, page 28, that your firm, quote, models the world as it is, not as it may be. Is that right?
Yes. That's correct.
And you also say that the differences between the way Dominion operates its system in the real world and the way your study and the difference between that and your study's recommendations is immaterial.
Yes.
Okay. And you say that Mr. Burgess is unfounded and incorrect in critiquing your modeling as not accurately representing Dominion's actual operating practices, right?
Yes.
Okay, and a few pages later, you say the Guidehouse is modeling what it believes operating reserves should be, not what they have been in the past, right?
Correct.
Okay. So, and you go on to say that there would be significant differences between the actual costs incurred by Dominion for integrating solar over the last 2 years versus what those costs may have been with a more appropriate operating reserve requirement.
Yes.
So when Mr. Burgess testified that the Guidehouse model misrepresented Dominion's actual operating practices over the last 2 years, was that incorrect?
I believe that is incorrect. Yes, the model does not include the same level of operating reserves that Dominion has been holding over the last 2 years, but the system is otherwise dispatched in the exact same manner as Dominion's in our forecast as Dominion has historically. And as has been discussed, Dominion is taking our recommendation for increased operating reserve requirements under serious consideration and will very likely make that adjustment themselves. So therefore, the way that we model the system absolutely matches our forward-looking modeling that starts in 2022 absolutely matches how Dominion will very likely be dispatching their system for the entirety of that 10-year forecast period.
But it doesn't match how they've operated their system with Tranche 1 basically on it for the last 2 years. Is that right? Just in terms of the way they've actually operated it, the numbers are different.
One single aspect, the minimum operating reserve requirement, does not match. That does not mean that that on a macro level it does not match. On a system dispatch level, it matches.
Okay, but this proceeding is about the VIC charge, which hinges on that minimum. Okay, So as to that, they're not operating it in the way that you've recommended yet. Is that right?
Correct. Because we have recommended that in order to actually integrate this level of solar, there is one change that they do need to make to their operations, in that they need to maintain a higher level of minimum operating reserves.
Right. And that will, I mean, that one change has significant implications for how they operate their system, right? I mean, they have to.
It does.
They have to include. Okay.
It does.
And did you hear what Miss Desk Witness Hanslick, the control room operator, say that he has not read your study?
Yes.
Okay. And did you hear him discuss some of the solar generating days, including August 16th, 2021?
I did.
And I believe he said on that day, forecast for that day was about 450 megawatts of solar. And that's pretty close to what the maximum was that day. Hear that?
Mm-hmm.
And he said he'd treat
I did hear that,
40% of that as, yeah. And I guess this is their current situation is they treat 40% of that as non-firm and procure operating reserves for that. So something like 180 megawatts in operating reserves.
Yes, I heard him say that.
Okay. So that's the current reality, but under your study for tranche one, which would I think would be applicable to August 16th, Dominion would need to carry 557 megawatts in operating reserves instead of 180?
I don't believe that would be entirely applicable, because the entirety of tranche one is not quite online. It is close to it, but it is only about 80% of tranche one, so that would be somewhat reduced. But yes, ultimately what we are saying is that the operating reserves that Dominion holds should be higher than what they have been holding in the past.
Okay, let's just say if it's 80%, let's say it's 500 megawatts. That would be significantly more than what they've carried. Like you just said, it would be in the future they'd need to carry more, right?
But again, that is the total minimum operating reserve requirement. That is not simply the operating reserve requirement that is attributable to solar, right? If you look at if you look at the table in my study, referring back to table 1, the incremental operating reserve requirement for August for all of tranche 1 is 307 megawatts. It is not 557. The incremental operating reserve requirement is 307, because there are other operating reserve requirement needs on Dominion systems. So yes, the operating reserves on that date would be increased based on my study if Dominion had been following my recommendations, obviously prior to my study being published. But it would, if operating reserves were increased to, if the minimum operating reserve requirement were increased to 500 megawatts for that day, that would not be 500 megawatts just to accommodate the 450 megawatts of solar. That would be about 250 megawatts to accommodate the 450 megawatts of solar, and another 250 megawatts to accommodate Dominion's other operating reserve requirement needs.
Okay. Now let's think of I believe Mr. Bell discussed February 2021. There were some charts in there, low production days. It was that, I believe, that winter storm that clobbered Texas.
Yeah.
And I think that the solar production there was like 200 megawatts, maybe a little bit less than that. And I guess I would like to understand, the application of your VIC to that. What would be the on a day like that, what would be the reserves, the operating reserves that Dominion would need to carry on that day?
On a day like that, the minimum operating reserve requirement that Dominion would have to carry based on the actual expected solar generation would be reduced, because the expected solar generation would be reduced. However, that is not a day in which it is likely that the minimum operating reserve requirement would be a binding constraint.
Okay, so you're saying
that's really.
I understood. Okay, go ahead.
No, please go ahead.
Well, I guess I was a little confused then by your study. I thought that you had set monthly numbers and that, for example, in
We did.
February, okay. And so
We
how
did,
does
but
that
again,
apply on a,
there is a difference. There's a significant difference that is important to keep in mind between the minimum operating reserve requirement and the actual available operating reserves. And the minimum operating reserve requirement is only a binding constraint in a small handful of hours. So yes, the actual operating reserves that solar would require on a day in February where there is a big storm and there is not much solar going to be expected would be somewhat reduced. However, there would still be, for other significant reasons, there would still be a significant amount of available operating reserves from combustion turbines that are not currently in use, combined cycles that are somewhat ramped down so that coal, because you need some generation of coal, et cetera. So it is not actually a binding constraint on those days. And the available operating reserves on the system is going to be in significant excess of what the minimum operating reserve requirement actually is.
so under your recommendation, they would not be required to increase, they wouldn't be required to keep 500 megawatts in reserve for that day?
They would not be required to. However, they likely would have significantly more than that in terms of available operating reserves, just from the nature of how they have to operate their system reliably.
Okay, so and if they do have that available, that would not be charged to, under your calculations, those costs would be backed out, and so they would not be charged to solar operators?
Correct. Those changes in operating costs in those hours are not related to, again, the change in operating costs in those hours would not be related to the operating reserve requirement in those hours specifically. So there is, there's no actual impact from solar that is being charged there.
Okay. Those are my questions. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
South Carolina Coastal Conservation League, Southern Alliance for Clean Energy.
This is Emma Clancy on behalf of CCL and SACE. No questions for this witness.
South Carolina Department of Consumer Affairs.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I do have a few questions. Good morning, Mr. Dave. My name is Roger Hall. I'm a Deputy Consumer Advocate with the Department of Consumer Affairs. How are you?
I'm good, thank you, Mr. Hall. How are you today?
Doing well. I don't have any questions about the actual VIC or reserve recommendations or any potential deficiencies, but I did want to understand a few basic things and ask about your involvement.
Sure.
So following up on a couple of questions from the commission this morning, do you agree that that a VIC study would take 1 to 3 months to complete?
I think that is a accurate assessment. I think that 1 month is a very tight deadline, but is potentially feasible if you have a very strong starting point. This VIC study took about 1.5 months. It was, which was a tighter deadline than I would have liked, but was only feasible because of the significant amount of work that Guidehouse has done in the Southeast already, and so we already had a very strong baseline to start from.
Gotcha. So I want to ask about the difference. So you referred to a variable integration costs, the rate PR1, variable integration charges. Are they the same other than the costs are to Dominion and the charges are to the renewable generators?
Yes, those are functionally the same thing, and I believe that I might have been interchanging the words cost and charge here. For the purposes of what I've been saying, they should functionally mean the same thing.
Okay. So your variable integration costs are the same as the charges that are in the rate PR1 tariffs?
Yes.
Okay. Do you know why those charges changed from the first amended application that was submitted on June 7th until the second amended application submitted on June 25th?
Yes, I do. Those charges changed because when we initially conducted this modeling exercise, we incorporated the capacity additions in Integrated Resource Plan 8 to replace the coal plants that are retiring, which is some combined cycle and some combustion turbines that are coming online in 2028. But we had erroneously not retired the coal plants, so we had to rerun the final 3 years of the forecast to get correct numbers with those coal plants retired.
Okay. So your study, so your study was revised between the 27th and the 7th and the 25th. And I believe the final date.
That's correct.
And I believe the final date on your study was the 29th. June 29th.
That sounds correct.
Okay. Do you recall when you were retained by Dominion or DESC?
I believe that conversations started in mid-April, and I was formally retained by Dominion in May.
And what was the? So I might not phrase this correctly, and so you forgive me on the terminology, but of all the data you used, approximately what was the date of the most recent data that was used in your models?
I mean, that's a very wide-ranging question. We used, for formulating the long-term capacity additions and retirements for Dominion system, we used their modified IRP, and for our benchmarking process to compare our near-term forecasts to recent historical trends, we had access to actual unit-level dispatch for all the assets on Dominion system for the calendar years 2018, 19, and 20. Additionally, on a higher level in terms of for the entire Eastern Interconnect, because as I believe I've mentioned in my testimony, we do not model an islanded system. We do not model a service territory on its own. We actually model the entire Eastern Interconnect on a fully nodal basis. By nodal, I mean we represent the full transmission infrastructure of North America. And so by doing that, we ensure that we are properly capturing all of the dynamic interchanges between balancing authorities and pools. And so the data for all of that is from our from Guidehouse's spring 2021 reference case that was all updated between March and May of 2021.
Okay, but if I understood you correctly, the DESC specific data was all from 2020 or before?
For the operational data that we used for the baseline comparisons, yes, it was all for calendar year 2020, 2018 through 2020. I am not sure what the date of publication of the modified IRP was.
Okay. So we've heard some testimony about the complexity of this this issue and expense. Do you think any other party could have done the type of study you did before you did it?
There are other parties and firms that are qualified to do this kind of study. However, I believe that they would need a level of data from Dominion with respect to the 8760 hourly generation shape for their existing solar facilities and the actual operations of all of their plants that might have been difficult for another party to come by. In order to be as accurate as possible, at least.
Sure. All right, I think that's all the questions I have. I appreciate it. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you.
Office of Regulatory Staff.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I have no cause for this witness. Thank you.
Commissioner questions. Commissioner Powers.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I know you've been up there for quite a while, and I just have a few questions. When I first started looking at this stuff a couple of months ago, just to be sure I knew what I was doing, I pulled a dictionary on the word tranche. And the dictionary that I looked at, I thought it was a little bit of levity there. It said that tranche means a portion of something, especially money. And I guess that's what we're pretty much talking about. Has Guidehouse worked for renewable companies in the past or just investor-owned utilities?
Commissioner, we have worked for a number of renewable companies. I have worked directly with multiple renewable developers all across the country, California, Texas, New York, New England, Illinois. I've worked with renewable developers that have interest in a specific plant, and I have worked with renewable developers that have interest in assets all around North America.
Have you worked for any renewables in South Carolina?
Off the top of my head, I do not believe that I personally have evaluated any specific renewable assets in South Carolina. I know I have worked with renewable developers who have been interested in market prices and fundamentals across the country, including South Carolina. However, I cannot say for certain whether any of them have then gone on to actively develop projects in South Carolina.
Okay. A moment ago, you were talking about the geographic footprint, and I made a note.
Mm-hmm.
You said you used data from Dominion service areas. Are these service areas all in-state or Dominion's total?
Yes.
Okay, good.
These service areas are specifically for the Dominion, South Carolina service area, Commissioner.
All right. In your rebuttal testimony, you argue that guideline studies based on what operating reserve requirements should be, not what they have been in the past. Is that correct?
Yes, sir, that is correct.
Why should operating reserves be greater going forward than what they have been historically for Dominion?
Well, Commissioner, that's a really great question. The fact of the matter is that the focus of the study, the design of the study, was to calculate the operating reserve requirement to account for an event that we believe that would be very exceedingly likely to occur at least once in a 10-year period, so a 1 in 10-year type event, but it's not something that would occur frequently. So, as I indicated in my testimony, the fact that Dominion has not experienced such an event in the past 2 years, as this first tranche of solar has begun to come online, is neither surprising nor statistically significant, because a 2-year sample period is considerably smaller than the 10-year period that we're talking about, where we're expecting at least one of these events to occur. However, in order to be properly prepared for such a 1 in 10-year event, it would be necessary to increase the operating reserve requirement. It is my understanding that over the past 30 years, that there has been at least one such event in each decade where Dominion did not have a sufficient amount of operating reserves. And that is a phenomenon that is very likely to continue going into the future. And if Dominion does not increase their minimum operating reserve requirement, then when that 1 in 10-year event does occur, and Dominion does have a shortage of operating reserves, it will cost them a significant amount of money in other avenues. It may cost them a significant amount of money to acquire imported energy from their neighbors. It might cost them a significant amount of money to have to shed load and call for a demand response incident. Or it might cost them a significant amount of money if they overall fail reliability and are subject to NERC penalties and fines. So the point is that either Dominion can increase their minimum operating reserve requirement, which does increase to a certain extent overall system costs, and by quantifying that and applying that as a VIC charge in PPAs, that cost can be attributed to the solar generators that are causing that cost, or if Dominion were to continue business as usual and not increase minimum operating reserve requirements, when those costs are incurred because there is such an outage event, not only is there a very good chance that those costs would be greater than the overall cost of increasing the minimum operating reserve requirement, but those costs would then be passed on to Dominion's customers as opposed to the parties that actually caused those costs.
In your answer, you mentioned if Dominion were subject to certain fines or penalties, if they were stuck with certain fines or penalties, shouldn't that be a cost to the stockholder and not the ratepayer?
To be honest, Commissioner, I am not entirely certain. My expertise is in wholesale power market dispatching and production cost analysis. It is not exactly in how such NERC fines would be allocated. That is a little bit outside my area of expertise.
One of the earlier Dominion witnesses, or maybe more than one, have talked about certain solar days, pulled up recent graphs to show the effect of certain days. Isn't it easy to cherry pick certain days or certain solar events to justify a study the way you want it to be?
Well, Mr. Commissioner, I would kind of push back a little bit on the idea of cherry picking, because as I mentioned, the whole point is that the increased operating reserve requirement is not something that would be is not something that would be called on regularly. It is not something that is to account for an event that is going to occur on a daily or monthly or even yearly basis. It is to account for an event that would occur once in 10 years. So I think it is actually very informative to look at recent historical days where you did not have such a extreme 1 in 10 year event, but you had something that was more so than normal to illustrate the fact that that such events can and do occur.
Well, I think rather than I think it was like a 10-day period or 15-day period, wouldn't a 60-day period be more reliable? I know we had today or the last few days, I'm looking at, we either had rain or we're getting rain. The more days you look at, the more reliable your prediction is.
Well, Mr. Commissioner, that is true to a certain extent. However, the kind of event that I'm talking about is not one that would occur over a long period of time. It is something that would occur in a single hour or 2 hours, or maybe even just a single 30-minute period where suddenly expected solar generation drops by a significant amount and you need to call on those operating reserves. So I think it is very informative to look at how that occurs or can occur in a single day.
Okay. And when you say certain events, you're talking about a thunderstorm or cloudiness or are you talking about a mechanical shutdown of some sort?
Mr. Commissioner, I am talking about anything that would impact, anything that would potentially impact the solar facility's ability to deliver power at the level that they predicted they would be able to deliver power, which in all likelihood means we are talking about weather events. However, there are, as you astutely point out, there are other issues that can interrupt power delivery, such as mechanical issues and transmission outages.
Thank you, Mr. David. Your answer has been very helpful to me.
Chairman Williams.
Thank you, Commissioner.
Commissioner Caston.
I think it's still morning. Good morning, Mr. David.
Good morning, Commissioner. And I'm in Chicago, so it is very much still morning for me.
A little earlier. And this may be overlapping Mr. Hall's question some and maybe Commissioner Powers. But I want to try to simplify this as much as possible and as succinctly as possible. And I know that is a very tall order, but let's try that.
It is.
I'm going to start, I guess, with the 1 hour ahead thing, 1 hour ahead forecast. If I understood you correctly, and I'm, I guess, paraphrasing, that 1 hour ahead forecast would make a model or modeling maybe more accurate. But if I understood you correctly, you're saying and that information is available, it can be acquired or purchased, I guess. But if I understood you correctly, from a real world position, that having the ability to flip a switch within that time frame to where it's of value is what matters. In other words, if you can't generate what you need within that time frame or with the appropriate generation in that time frame, it is little value to have 1 hour forecast. Is that what I heard, or did I not? Did I just totally miss that?
No, Commissioner, that is very close to the mark. The idea here is that yes, there are commercially available 1 hour ahead forecasts, and if that is something that that we felt was appropriate to use, that would be a different conversation. However, what you were kind of getting at is that it is not simply the ability to reduce forecast error that we need to consider, but it is also Dominion's ability to react to forecast error. So if when we're looking at when we're using a 4 hour ahead forecast and we're using that to determine what the minimum operating reserve requirement is, that allows the system for the system operator to have a longer look ahead to determine how to meet that need and what assets need to be turned on and ramped up and which assets can be left offline. If we were only looking at a 1 hour ahead schedule, yes, that would reduce forecast error, but that also would not guarantee, if Dominion was solely reliant on a 1 hour ahead forecast, that would not guarantee their ability to actually maintain the level of operating reserves to react to unexpected losses in solar generation.
Okay, along those lines then, is that something, the difficulty and inability to react in that time frame, is that something unique to Dominion, or is that pretty much ubiquitous through the industry?
Well, Commissioner, I wouldn't necessarily say that it's unique to Dominion, but I also wouldn't necessarily say that it's ubiquitous to the industry. It very much depends on a number of factors, namely what the overall system load is and what the actual resources available are to the system. If you had another system that had similar needs but had a significantly higher penetration of flexible resources or battery storage or combustion turbines, that might be a system that was better able to react to an operating reserve requirement formulated off of a forecast error using a 1 hour ahead solar forecast. But for a system like Dominion's, that is not something that is that is not something that would be as useful. So I wouldn't necessarily say that it is unique to Dominion, but there are potentially other systems out there that would be more capable of reacting more quickly.
Is that more because of the mix of generation resources?
Yes, Commissioner. That is significantly due to the existing mix of generation resources.
Then perhaps an adjustment or rearrangement of generation resources may ameliorate that some, or provided it's economical, makes good sense.
Well, Commissioner, I believe that Dominion already, works hard to operate their system in the least cost, most efficient way possible. So I think that what it would actually require would be not changing the way that the current system is operated, right, but actually changing the resources that are available to the system, which is something that would also require a significant amount of capital investment.
Right. I guess that's what I didn't say it well, but that's what I was trying to say, and that it's more the mix, not how they're operating it now. You say they're operating it well and efficiently with what they have now, but the mix is the difference, which would modify how soon they could respond. And changing that mix is no inexpensive issue.
Yes, sir. That is absolutely correct. You could increase your ability to respond by significantly increasing battery storage, combustion turbine, and natural gas combined cycle capacity, so that you would be less reliant in general on steam turbines, both coal and natural gas, that are not as flexible and have more rigid operating constraints. However, as we have just discussed, that would require a very significant capital investment.
Okay, would it make sense, since we're on this subject, when we think in terms of IRPs and we're looking, 15 years down the road, but also looking at, okay, in year, whatever it is, and I don't remember, there's going to be an additional capacity needed or whatever. Would it perhaps make sense for the utility to consider those factors too, as far as the mix relative to filling that capacity need?
From a high level, sir, I believe that would make sense to consider it, but that would then require its own set of really significant, intricate studies to determine how to most effectively integrate those different generating technologies.
Understand, which is actually, I think, getting to my next question. In your discussion with Mr. Holman, much discussion on the Guidehouse model, data, analysis, outcomes, and I'm sure other things. Correct?
Correct.
Pretty much covered all of those areas and probably more. And I want to make sure I understand, I guess, a summary of what all that discussion was. Like, for example, on page 9 of your Guidehouse study, right at the bottom of it, let's see, you talk about the key assumptions are described in subsections below, which subsections below on my page are the kind of footnotes. But I'm assuming, is that the subsections 2.1? Let's see, where is it? Better yet, why don't you just, without going into a lot of detail, what subsections are you referring to? I think I know. I want to make sure I know.
With respect to the key assumptions?
Yes, the key assumptions described in subsections below. You don't need to go through all the key assumptions, but what are those subsections?
No, those are 2.1.1, which is the existing generating resources. 2.1.2, which is the changes that are incorporated in the modified integrated resource plan 8. 2.1.3, which is the system load. 2.1.4, which is the solar penetration tranches. And 2.1.5, which is the fuel prices. And then 2.1.6, which is the long-term capacity expansion plans for regions beyond DESC, which, as I mentioned, plays an important role because there are net interchanges between Dominion Energy and its neighboring balancing authorities.
We're on the same wavelength then. That's what I thought you meant. And on page 11 of the Guidehouse study, you say the modified 2020 IRP was the basis of the study. Is that correct?
That is correct, sir.
And go ahead.
I'm sorry, I was just going to say, it is the basis of the study in terms of things like capacity additions and retirements, existing resource mix, and system load. For a couple of the other key assumptions, such as in particular fuel prices and generic expansion beyond Dominion, those are obviously not aspects that are coming from that specific IRP.
Understood. And I think that's the way it's defined in your study, if I understood that correctly too. So RP8, Plan RP8 was used in your assumptions.
That's correct, sir.
With the high demand side management, I think 1% in 2021, correct?
Yes, sir, that is correct.
And on page 12 of the study, you show a relatively flat annual peak demand and I guess the peak demand. That's correct.
Yes, sir, that is correct. What Figure 5 is showing on that page that you're referring to is the annual peak demand in each forecast year, which is, as you observed, relatively flat. It does grow slightly, but not very much. The expectation here, as indicated in the modified IRP Plan 8, is that net peak demand will not grow very quickly over the next 10 years in Dominion service territory.
Yes, sir. And if I understand it correctly, the 0.55% growth rate is on the annual load, and the 0.47% is on the peak load?
That is correct, yes.
And those are compounded. Is that like compounded interest? In other words, 1.55 times whatever the annual load is in 2022, and then 1.55 times whatever that number is for 2023 is compounded, correct?
Yeah, that is correct. That is correct, sir. However, those are not simply saying that the annual load is increased by 0.55% each year over year. That is simply what the average is for the compound annual growth rate over the course of those 10 years.
Understand. Okay. Finally, there was much discussion about the model and the model using a Monte Carlo analysis, correct?
Correct.
Which I believe gets its name from Monte Carlo and gambling, correct?
I believe that is correct, sir.
And not so much gambling, but trying to get the odds.
Yes,
so
that is correct.
As I understand it, in essence, what that Monte Carlo analysis is a risk analysis, correct?
Yes, sir.
And it's basically a probability distribution that simply looks at possible outcomes and probabilities of those outcomes, correct?
At a high level, yes, sir, that is correct.
Well, I got to stay at a high level. If you get too deep, you've lost me. But in general, that's the idea.
That is the idea, yes.
And I've heard you mention 1 in 10 year type of event, and I also heard that in some other hearings we've had through the course of my brief tenure here, which I remember when I first heard that, I thought, man, that doesn't sound good enough to me, but hey, I guess that's an industry standard, correct?
That is an industry standard, sir, yes. And I think as we've seen in some other places like Texas, if you don't plan for a 1 in 10 year event, the results can be catastrophic.
I bet if you went back to 1750, you'd probably find something even worse if you were trying to cross the Delaware. In any event, but the point being is it is a probability analysis looking at possible outcomes, and you're looking at events, and you're looking at that worst case, what if 1 in 10 years. And I think Commissioner Powers kind of touched on that, but I think what you're saying and what I understand the value of this to be is you're not really interested in averages or just kind of, you know, the more data points I have, the greater, thinking about in terms of a bell curve, you're looking for that probability, that 1 in 10 year, or it might be, let's say that 2% event, you know, that's going to happen. Is that correct?
Yes, sir, that's accurate.
And I was told some years back when we were considering things in my industry about that, looking back at historical, paleontological, climatological data. God, that's hard to say. And such as that, is that these events that occurred, say, whenever it looks like they occurred from this historical information, was when I asked the question, can that occur again? And she said, no, it will occur again, only worse. And I asked, now, why is that? Said, well, because if it's happened before, it'll happen again, but it'll be worse because we have more people now, more demands. Is that a fair assessment in this 1 in 10? If it's happened before, it will and can happen again?
Yes, I believe that is a fair assessment. I think that's exactly the point, that if it has happened before, it will happen again. I'm not going to take any opinion on whether it will be worse when it happens again. But I think the point here is that yes, this is the kind of event that has happened before, and it absolutely will happen again. It's not a matter of if, it's a matter of when.
See, what I've observed in my brief time span here in I guess, working life, is that we tend to look at things through the lens of what we can remember, or what our grandparents taught us, or what we heard. You know, we think it's this long time frame, but it's really such a little time frame. So it's why I'm still a little baffled by the 1 in 10. I don't feel like that seems very narrow to me, but if that's a standard, that's a standard. Worry about that later. But to sum it up, I appreciate it. I think I have a much better understanding of it. And it seems like there's a lot of discussion about trying to get these things, okay, it says this in the RP, we need to get this to match, but we are talking about projections and models and trying to run enough series of those to where it gives you a range of probability that makes sense or that is reasonable. Is that correct?
Yes, sir, I would agree to that.
All right. Thank you. If I go any deeper, I'm going to get lost. But thank you. No more questions.
Thank you, sir.
Mr. Chairman.
Commissioner Irvin.
Thank you. It's good to have you with us, Mr. David. I'd like to hear your thoughts about the current lithium-ion battery storage that's coming on the market. Do you think it's going to, what do you predict is going to be the trend line in terms of cost and effectiveness in the next 10 years?
Thank you, Commissioner Irvin. That is a really interesting question. Battery storage over the next 10 years, not just in Dominion service territory, but around the country, is going to be an increasingly important, tool in the dispatch stack. What is going to be really important to make that a better available tool is going to be, declining technology costs, which Guidehouse does see occurring over time. However, it's still going to remain fairly expensive on a capital cost level over the next 10 years. It's not going to be declining to the same dollar per kilowatt level as thermal generators or even more conventional renewables. However, it is going to continue to play a really increasing role in utilities' ability to integrate renewable capacity and serve their load. And it's going to come from a couple of places. I think what you're seeing in the near term is you are seeing a number of shorter duration batteries, by which I mean 1 to 1.5 hour batteries that have the capability to store, to pump in enough energy to charge up, to store, to then discharge at full capacity for about an hour. And those batteries, because of the nature of their operating constraints with cycling limitations and throughput efficiency and degradation, those batteries are not going to be used very much to actually play in energy arbitrage and to generate on the market into the energy market, but rather those batteries are going to specifically be used to help utilities meet their ancillary services obligations. Specifically, batteries are very well suited for frequency regulation and to a certain extent operating reserves. However, as those kinds of batteries continue to come online and those specific ancillary services markets become a bit oversaturated, you're going to start seeing a push to build longer duration batteries, 4-hour, 8-hour, even 12-hour batteries when we go out to the late 2030s, early 2040s. And those are batteries that are going to actually be used on a utility scale level to actually charge from the excess renewables, or if necessary, from excess thermal generation, and then sell back into the energy market and dispatch energy when called upon. That's going to be an increasingly important part of our national generation mix over the next 10 to 20 years. But I think one of the things that you touched on, and it's one of the things that is going to make this most challenging, is the capital cost investment required to actually build these batteries, which is currently at a fairly high level that requires, probably some measure in many markets, it probably requires some measure of subsidization or other, hedging agreements to ensure that the developers are able to get a return on their investment. But I think that there is an expectation over the next 5 to 10 years, as this technology becomes more mature, that the capital cost associated with it will at least gradually decline to become more competitive with more traditional technologies.
Do you see this current generation of lithium-ion battery serving us for 5 years, 10 years, or we're going to see better technology even before that?
Again, really great question, Commissioner. I am not entirely certain. I think that I think that the existing, current technology of lithium-ion, I think that those are going to be in use for quite some time. I don't think that anything that is built today is going to suddenly become obsolete in 5 to 10 years. However, I would also imagine that as we always see over the next 10 years or 20 years, there will be emerging technologies and improvements in existing technologies that should change the way that systems operate. It's just really difficult to predict what those implications might be.
And let's talk about solar cost. Do you see there's still trending down, or have we seen a leveling off of cost reduction in solar?
Are you talking about the capital investment required to install solar?
Yes, sir.
Then, sir, I actually do see that those costs to install it still coming down. I don't think that technology is fully mature. I don't think that where we're at today in terms of the capital investment requirement for those facilities is where we will continue to be over the next 5 to 10 years. I do think that those technology costs will continue to decline as that technology continues to become more and more mature.
Do you think that commissions should try to incentivize QFs in some way to add storage in existing QFs to help mitigate the fact that power is not dispatchable?
I do believe that it is a really good idea for renewable facilities to install on-site storage. I think that that is beneficial for a number of different parties. I think that is beneficial for grid operators because it adds a significant measure of reliability to those intermittent resources. I think it is an advantage to developers because it adds additional revenue streams for them. However, I am not certain if that is something that I would say that the commission should incentivize. I think that's it's a little bit out of my purview.
Understood. I'd be interested in hearing your take on the study that integration study that we asked for 2 years ago, and whatever reason we haven't been able to get it off the ground, primarily to cost and planning issues. We're dealing with the new Act 62 that we're implementing. Do you think that the Guidehouse would be interested in assisting with that study, perhaps, if we put out a request for proposal?
Yes, sir. I think if you put out a request for proposal, that Guidehouse would absolutely respond to it, and that it is the kind of study that is very much within our wheelhouse. It is that is the kind of study that is a strength of ours.
Very good. And you think 2 to 3 months is a reasonable time frame? Assuming you got the bid or you got the contract, is that a reasonable time frame for completion?
Well, I mean, to be honest, sir, I think that that's not an answer that I am really prepared to give right now because it really depends very much on the overall scope. I can certainly see a limited scope that would be very easily completed in 3 months or fewer. But if there is a potentially expansive scope, that could add to the timeline. And so that is something that would that I don't think I could answer until I was a little bit more clear on what specific your needs would be.
Sure, that's fair. And so once we got that study, tell us how it might be used as we evaluate a fixed, permanent way to determine the VIC.
Well, I think that once you've got that study, then I think that you've got actually a pretty similar study then to conduct to what we just did. I think that the advantage of such a study would be to have a greater level of detail for expected future conditions. And I think that if you had a greater level of detail for expected future conditions, then you would be able to have a better understanding of how the system will operate. However, I would also say that given the timeline that you are operating on, and the fact that you have, as you mentioned, you've been trying to get the study off the ground for 2 years and have not done so yet, I would caution strongly against saying that you want to wait until a completion of an integration study before making a ruling on a VIC, because I believe that any change to the VIC calculated from that study would be probably very not particularly significant. Such a VIC would be very close to the VIC that I have calculated in my study, and if you were to wait until such a study were completed to set a firm VIC and leave the VIC at the current interim amount, you would end up with ratepayers subsidizing solar generators for the costs that they are creating.
Okay. So your thought is it might be better not to rush to the study, but perhaps might be better to wait until after this proceeding and see where we are in terms of going forward. Is that what you're saying?
In terms of conducting the study that you just mentioned, yes, I would agree with that, sir.
Does it concern you at all that we're going into year 3 pretty soon with an interim VIC subject to true up?
Yes, sir, that does concern me. As I mentioned, the result of my analysis indicate that the actual variable integration cost is greater than what the interim VIC is. And so as a result, the longer that interim VIC remains in place, the longer that solar developers are being subsidized by ratepayers.
That's my concern, and that's why I'm kind of sounding the alarm bell. If we kick the can down the road for too long, there could be an adverse impact on ratepayers, correct?
That is absolutely my concern as well, sir.
And so, in that sense, it might be better to press forward sooner than later to eliminate any potential subsidization, because the longer you wait, the more impact it's going to have on ratepayers in their monthly bill, correct? Potentially.
Yes, Commissioner Irvin, I would agree with that as well.
Thank you. Those are all the questions I have.
Thank you, Commissioner.
Commissioner Williams.
Thank you, Vice Chair Belser. Mr. David, thank you for your endurance. I have, I think, some bigger picture questions.
Sure thing.
In table 11 of your study, I think you even mentioned this, the highest level of operating reserves that's required in the different tranches is in the month of April. Is that correct?
That's correct, ma'am.
At a big picture level, I just want to understand why April.
That is a good question, ma'am. Honestly, the reason for April, and this is a result of the modeling exercise that we did to calculate the potential for solar forecast uncertainty, and I think that has to do with the unpredictability of weather in April. I think that what we have seen in historical data is that there is less predictability and more variability in some of those shoulder months, at least with respect to when the sun does or does not shine, as compared to summer months where the expected solar output is actually greater.
That makes sense. I would never have thought of that. So thanks. On page 28 at the end of, I've forgotten now if this is the end of your report or the end of your testimony. It probably doesn't matter. You talk about projects interconnecting and increasing the reserve requirements, and you mention a couple of examples of ways to diminish that requirement, and you talk about solar being configured to operate flexibly. What does that mean?
To my knowledge, Commissioner, and this is something that I have not had a great deal of experience with. This is something that I've learned a little bit more about with discussions from the folks at Dominion. But there are ways in which the solar operations at a facility can be controlled by Dominion as opposed to by the solar facility operators, and Dominion would be able to, in certain circumstances, modulate the output in ways that would better match their system load. However, I am not really qualified to speak to exactly how that would work. I believe that is something that one of the prior witnesses, such as witness Hanslick, could answer a little bit better.
And I think you might have just testified something that I heard earlier. Thank you very much. No further questions.
Thank you.
Commissioner Thomas.
Thank you. Thank you, Mr. David. Continuing along the lines of talking about the VIC studies, and whether you're talking about one that's the higher level statewide study or a company specific study, I mean, those are basically going to have to be updated on a pretty regular basis, or they're going to become stale anyway. I mean, no matter what we do. Isn't that correct?
Sir, what do you mean by updating on a continual basis? You mean updating the VIC study on a continual basis?
Well, on some regular schedule, yes.
Well, yes, sir. I would agree to an extent that it would be good to update it regularly. However, I would caution against depending on that too much, because then I believe that you get to something that I was just discussing with Commissioner Irvin about having interim or temporary VIC charges, and I think that there are some problems there. The first of all is the issue as we were just discussing about if the interim charge is actually lower than what it should be, then you are having solar developers are being subsidized by ratepayers. But then I believe that also if you have an interim VIC that is subject to change, I believe that adds a level of uncertainty that may make things a little bit more challenging for developers. So I don't think that would actually serve either side very well.
Okay, well, I guess what I'm trying to understand is that it just seems to me that the numbers are going to become outdated or obsolete over some reasonable period of time. I don't know if it's every 2 years or 3 or 4 years, but I mean, how long can you rely on a VIC study and not get into the situation where you're either over or undercharging?
Well, sir, I think that really depends on how significantly the system itself is changing. I think that given the plans for the system in terms of long-term capacity additions and retirements specifically, with there being relatively few until you start to retire the coal plants at the end of the 2020s and replace them with some additional combined cycle or combustion turbines. Given that and the relatively low level of expected load growth, I don't think that there is a significant risk of these numbers becoming stale or obsolete in the foreseeable future. I think that once you get out to around the end of our forecast period, that's when the system is actually going to start to undergo more changes in terms of more capacity additions and retirements, more new technologies coming online, such as battery storage that is available, that is expected to start being built in that service territory in the 2030s. And once you start talking about more large-scale changes to the actual system makeup, then I think that you need to start talking about a whole new VIC study. But I think that based on the expectations for how the system is going to evolve over the next 10 years, I don't think that there is a significant risk of this analysis becoming stale or out of date in that time period.
Okay, thank you. That's very helpful to me. So let me ask you a little bit again, getting back to the reserve margin and following up a little bit on Commissioner Powers' questions. There are many times when the reserve margin could come into play, and one that I'm wondering about right now, just seeing what's going on, specifically with very, very extremely hot weather out on the West Coast. I mean, you could have a situation where solar is producing at absolutely 100%, and we get some very hot weather here in the Carolinas. I mean, that could be, you could get everything you can get out of solar, but you're going to still need more. And so that's where, again, the reserve margin would come into play, perhaps, in one of those unusual events, 1 in 10 years or who knows how long. Would you agree with that?
Yes, sir, I would agree with that there are reserve needs beyond those for solar. However, I would again point to the fact that the incremental increase in operating reserve requirements that we calculated as necessary for this are specifically for integrating solar. So if you have a day where solar is expected to and is generating at its full output, but you have other needs to call on your operating reserves, that does not impact the fact that that you are going to have other days where solar is expected to be generating at a high level and suddenly drops off, and you need to call on your operating reserves for that.
Makes sense to me. Thank you. That's all I had.
Thank you, sir.
Chairman Williams, may I?
Yes, Commissioner Caston.
I want to, I hate to always do it this way. I want to make sure I understand what you just told Commissioner Thomas. relative to when should a VIC study be updated, if updated. And I think you were saying that, okay, if the demands, the projected demands, projected peak demands are relatively flat, if there are no significant energy capacity additions, improvements scheduled in the near future, if there's nothing significant occurring over the time period, whatever that time period is, then it doesn't make sense to update a VIC study. Is that what I heard?
Yes, sir. That is functionally what I said. The idea here being that you know it makes sense to update a VIC study or any other such study when you are looking at a market that is changing and evolving in a significant manner. And when we look at the next 10 years of operations on Dominion system, other than the integration of this solar capacity, you know, we've got the first tranche that is 80% of which is already online, and the rest of it is going to be, and the last bit of it is going to be online very soon, and the potential for 2 additional tranches totaling combined 400 megawatts of additional solar. Other than those, other than that, there really is not an expectation of significant changes to the system in terms of the generation fleet, the expected load, and the fuel mix, and you know, the transmission infrastructure, right? Those are all not going to change in a significant manner over the next 10 years. Therefore, it is reasonable to conclude that the variable integration cost over the next 10 years is not going to change significantly. However, it is also important to note, again, that we are certainly not saying that the variable integration charge is the same year over year, right? The variable integration charge does react to how the market changes, and there are definitely changes that are coming to neighboring systems such as Duke and Santee Cooper that impact their ability to sell power to Dominion, and thus impact Dominion's expected costs. And so that is why, you know, when we did this study, we ran 10 forecast years. We calculated a variable integration cost for each individual year, and then we used a net present value calculation to levelize that over 10 years to get what the actual cost of integrating solar over that full 10-year period would be. And so given how little I think there's expectation for there to be significant changes to Dominion's system over the next 10 years as compared to what we have modeled, I don't think it would be appropriate to expect that you would need to refresh this study in the near future.
Okay, so even though the avoided cost is evaluated every 2 years, the, I guess, VIC study relative to Dominion at this point in time for the next 10 years, absent something significant changing or occurring that's not in the current 10-year plan or projection, the VIC should be good, the VIC study should be good for 10 years, correct?
Yes, I believe that is the case.
And if I recall also in some of the testimony, there have been, I think maybe some of the interveners, I can't recall who, that are arguing for a fixed VIC. Now, some of them I think say it should be 0. Clearly, you do not concur with that, and Dominion does not concur with that, or RS does not concur with that. But VIC study, 10 years, we're okay. And that acronym means variable integrated cost, correct?
Yes, variable
integration cost. And that is for those energy sources that vary, that
Right,
have
so that
variable
is,
output.
Yeah, well, I mean, what it's attempting to do is saying, okay, there is an increase in system costs due to the need to increase the minimum operating reserve requirement, and that minimum operating reserve requirement is being driven by needing to integrate higher levels of solar capacity. And what makes it a variable integration charge is that we take the total cost and we divide it by the total solar generation. So it turns from a total dollars to $1 per megawatt hour. So that's what makes it variable, because then these solar generators are being charged this variable integration charge based on their amount, the amount that they output. So if it's a if it's a 2 megawatt solar plant, then it's the amount that it is charged is going to the total amount that it's charged is going to be significantly less than a 200 megawatt solar plant, just because its output is going to be that much less.
Okay, I think I understand it. So the additional resources, standby reserve resources, capacity are not just related to solar. You need them for various and sundry other causes and reasons, like that 1 in
That's
10,
correct, sir.
10 years. But that absent these systems, these solar or other variable systems, having the apparatus that would mitigate that additional cost, there is an additional cost, you're saying?
Yes, sir. That is what we are saying.
Okay. Thank you very much. You've answered my questions. Thank you.
Thank you.
Mr. David, I have a few questions for you before we break. Looking at your study and looking at your experience, it seems like you are very capable of asking or answering some questions regarding whether or not the solar market or the opportunity for new solar in Dominion Energy, South Carolina's territory, is saturated or not. Based on the information you reviewed for your study, can you speak to that?
Certainly, sir. What do you mean by saturated? Are you asking me if it's if I believe that it's getting to the point where there is no value to an additional incremental megawatt of solar?
Yes, sir.
Well, sir, in that case, I would say that no. The market is definitely not oversaturated. There is still room for additional solar capacity, and I think there is still plenty of room for that to be a profitable venture for a wide array of potential developers.
Okay. And so, based on the VIC and the other components of the avoided costs, you don't think the costs outweigh the rewards?
No, sir, I do not believe so. I believe that there is as I've indicated in my study, there is a cost associated with integrating solar that is really directly related to the need to increase the minimum operating reserve requirement in order to account for any potential solar shortfalls. However, even with that variable integration charge, I believe that the avoided costs from integrating solar for both avoided energy and avoided capacity costs do significantly outweigh that variable integration charge to the point where there is still plenty of opportunity for solar developers.
Good. During the course of this hearing, I feel as if there has been some level of tension between trying to figure out the most accurate of what it costs. Based on your experience, generally, and your experience in this proceeding, is there an incentive for, in your opinion, for Dominion Energy South Carolina to depress the avoided costs?
In my opinion, no, there really is not incentive for Carolina, for Dominion Energy South Carolina to suppress the avoided costs. They are able to, recover the costs that they incur to generate power, based on the rate structures that they are subject to. So if they were to come out with a higher avoided cost, that would lead to higher payments to solar generators, and that would end up simply costing ratepayers more, as opposed to impacting the bottom line for anybody at Dominion specifically.
Understood. And so, based on that analysis, the group that really needs protection, if you will, or they need to be considered, would be the ratepayer, because if there is an overpayment, it would be on their backs.
Yes, sir. Absolutely.
Okay. So you've answered a lot of questions, and before we let you go, I just want to make sure there's nothing else you think we need to know before we make. We have a while before we make our decision, but before you get off the stand, I just want to make sure there's nothing else you feel as if we need to know. We have a pretty important decision to make.
Well, sir, I have mentioned this, but I really want to kind of hammer this home, that there is a really significant difference between the minimum operating reserve requirement and the actual available operating reserves any hour, which can vary significantly. And I believe that a number of the other parties in this case have pointed at the fact that Dominion has historically held average operating reserves in excess not only of their baseline minimum level, but of what my study has indicated is required for the new minimum requirement level. And they have pointed to, other parties have pointed to that and indicated that this means that there's not actually a cost to integrate solar because you're already holding this many operating reserves. And that very much misses the point that, again, average available operating reserves and actual available operating reserves can vary significantly, and the available operating reserves don't necessarily have to be the same as the minimum operating reserves. That is, by definition, just a minimum requirement. And where the entire cost of increasing the minimum operating reserve requirement comes from, which is the basis for the VIC, is in the relatively small handful of hours, not even necessarily every single day across the year, but a small handful of hours where that operating reserve requirement is in fact a binding constraint. And without increasing the minimum operating reserve requirement, there would be a risk of operating reserve shortfall.
All right. Thank you, sir.
Before we release the witness, I have one follow-up question, please.
Yes, sir. Commissioner Urban.
Thank you. So I'm going to put you on the spot, and if you were a member of the South Carolina Public Service Commission, what would you be recommending as a target date to end the interim VIC and go to a 2-year review? Because whenever we've got to plan ahead, but at some point we've got to end the interim VIC with a true up. What's your best advice on what that target and time frame should look like?
Well, sir, my advice would be that should happen as soon as is possible. And the reason behind that is, as we've discussed, the VIC that I have presented as part of the study is considerably greater than the interim VIC that is currently in effect. And so the reason that I say that should occur as soon as possible. Obviously, these things don't happen overnight. There is some time that it takes, but as soon as possible, because the longer that the interim VIC is in place, then the longer solar developers are being subsidized by ratepayers because they are not paying for the full amount of the costs that they are causing.
And thank you. And finally, how do you envision a true up working with QFs that might be affected or ratepayers that might be affected? Walk us through that briefly.
To be honest, sir, I am not entirely certain. That's a little bit outside of my area of expertise. I would envision that it would entail looking back at how much energy they have generated since coming online, and how much they have actually paid per megawatt hour in their VIC, and determining what they would have been charged had the VIC been at the fixed level, whatever that ends up being, and from there determining a methodology to true that up by on some level charging the solar developers for that missing money, and some sort of I don't know if maybe some sort of bill credit to ratepayers would be appropriate as well. It's a little bit, the retail side is a little bit outside of my area of expertise.
So we might need forensic accounting expertise for that, right?
I believe that is correct, sir, and that is also a capability of Guidehouse, just so you know.
Well, I'm glad to hear that. We may have a request for a proposal out hopefully sooner than later, because it does concern me. The longer we kick the can down the road, the worse the problem becomes. And I think if we go ahead and address it sooner, there might be some ways to mitigate it. And you could foresee some ways perhaps how we could mitigate it over time, like payments over a time frame, as opposed to a lump sum.
Right.
Do you agree?
Yes, sir. Yes, sir. I agree.
Thank you. No further questions.
Mr. Chairman, this is Bland Hallman with Pine Gate, and I was wondering if I might have the chance to ask two recross questions on points that were made in response to Commissioner questions that were beyond what was in the earlier testimony. Very briefly.
Mr. Chairman, if I may respond.
Go right ahead.
Thank you. I think, first of all, the witness, you have not indicated whether or not commission questions have ended. And then the appropriate protocol would be to return to me and see whether or not the company has any redirect. And if there is no redirect, then I don't believe Mr. Hallman gets an opportunity to ask any more cross-examination questions. But I don't know that the commission questions are completed yet either.
Well, of course, we would like to, I thought they were done. I apologize to the commission for jumping in earlier. Of course, would never want to cut that off, Mr. Willoughby. I appreciate that. But I think that the commission has in the past allowed where commission questions have gone outside the scope of direct rebuttal, have allowed for cross even with no redirect. So they're two very brief questions. I think they're yes or no questions, and I'd like to ask them.
They're never yes or no questions for the most part. And I respect Mr. Holman interest in asking his question. Of course, I don't know what his questions are. I would say that obviously the commission sits in a very unique position. They ask the questions. My understanding of the commission's questions have been that they have been on target and relevant to the discussions in the testimony, both rebuttal and testimony, and in Mr. David's study. So Mr. Hallman had plenty of opportunity to ask those whatever questions he had, and I believe it would be inappropriate for him now to ask additional questions unless I have redirect, and if I have redirect, he would be able to ask questions, but only on the subject matter of my redirect.
All right. Are there any more commissioner questions? No. Attorney Willoughby, do you have any redirect?
Mr. Chairman, believing that Mr. David has fully and accurately answered the questions of the parties and the commission, we have no redirect, and we would ask that the witness be excused.
Mr. Holman, could you identify the areas where the commission went outside of the pre-filed testimony?
Yes, sir. Mr. Chairman, there are questions about there are no changes planned on the Dominion system over the next 10 years. And so a VIC might be fixed for that period. And I understood that to go beyond anything that had been discussed before. It's a very interesting topic, and one that I just had two questions about Dominion's plans and whether or not Mr. David had considered those in answering that question.
Mr. Chairman, if I might briefly respond, I would point out that the commission by statute has an obligation to look at these aborting cost issues every 2 years, and Mr. Holman knows that. And so any number of issues can be evaluated when that 2-year review comes up. Mr. David has very clearly indicated that his VIC study as of today accurately reflects the integration cost. We can make a determination 2 years hence whether or not those studies need to be updated and refreshed. If changes have taken place in the interim, it may have an impact. And therefore, issues could be, if there are changes, then they could be addressed at that time. But today, and in this proceeding, the VIC has been appropriately and accurately calculated and tendered to the commission for its consideration. And I would point out that Mr. David is the only witness in this proceeding that has so calculated the VIC. And we would therefore indicate that no additional questions would be needed or appropriate.
All right, Attorney Hallman, I'm going to deny your request. Thank you. Question for the parties. I see that the applicant has 2 more witnesses. Is that correct, applicant? 2 more witnesses?
Yes, Mr. Chairman, we have Mr. Folsom and Mr. Rooks are remaining witnesses.
Okay. To the parties, will there be extensive cross-examination for Mr. Folsom?
Mr. Chairman, this is John Burns for CC, but I do have some questions for Mr. Folsom, but they should be able to go fairly efficiently because it's on about 4 discrete topics in the documents.
Anyone else? And I'm sorry, Mr. David, you are excused. You may step down from the witness stand.
Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Any other party will they have questions for Mr. Folsom?
Mr. Chairman, Roger Hall, Department of Consumer Affairs. At this time, I do not have any that I suppose could change, but this time I do not have any plans.
All right. So as we discussed yesterday, we're ending today, the hearing at least, at 3 p.m. It's time for a lunch break, and I just wanted to make sure if we come back that we will be able to finish Mr. Folsom within the hour.
I'll do my best. I believe I can.
All right. We're in recess. I'm sorry. Did someone have something else to say?
I just want you to know who said that. This is John Burns.
Oh, yes, sir. I picked up on your voice now. All right. We're in recess until 2 o'clock.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman.